Welcome to the channel Stories to Relax. I'm Bento, and here we take things gently, letting the mind slow down as we dive into fascinating stories told at just the right pace to help you relax, or maybe even drift off to sleep. If you prefer a softer narration, try setting the playback speed to 0.8. The crowd pressed against the palace walls like a living flame, 50,000 voices screaming for blood, for the emperor's head, for the end of everything. Constantinople burned in the cold January of 532, and inside the throne room, Justinian prepared to flee. Belisarius stood at the entrance of the Hippodrome, watching the mob. He had 500 soldiers. The rebels had an entire city. The mathematics was simple, brutal, impossible. His officers waited for the order to retreat, to save themselves, to let the empire collapse into chaos. But retreat wasn't in his vocabulary. The general adjusted his helmet and drew his sword. The blade caught the light of the fires outside. His soldiers formed up behind him, silent, disciplined, ready. They had followed him through deserts and mountains, through victories that seemed like miracles. Now, he asked them for one more. The mob didn't see them coming. They were too busy celebrating their revolution, their new world. They didn't notice the formation moving through the narrow passages of the Hippodrome until it was too late. That day, Belisarius saved an empire that would never truly thank him. To understand why Belisarius stood at the entrance of the Hippodrome that day, ready to slaughter his own people to save an emperor, you need to go back 20 years. The Roman Empire in 510 wasn't the Rome of Caesar or Augustus. That Rome was dead, buried under centuries of invasions, plagues, and incompetence. This was Byzantium, the eastern half that survived, the Greek-speaking, Orthodox Christian, bureaucratic machine that still called itself Roman, but barely controlled anything beyond its own walls. The Western territories, Italy, Spain, North Africa, belonged to barbarian kingdoms now. Goths, Vandals, Franks. They wore Roman titles, minted coins with Roman symbols, but the empire itself was a memory. Belisarius was born somewhere in Thrace, the militarized borderland between civilization and chaos. No one recorded the exact year or village. He wasn't important enough. Thrace produced soldiers the way Egypt produced grain, constantly, efficiently, without much ceremony. Boys grew up watching the frontier, learning to ride before they could read, understanding that the world was divided into two categories, those who could fight and those who got conquered. He entered the Byzantine army as a teenager, one more anonymous recruit in the endless machine. Nothing about him suggested greatness. He wasn't from an aristocratic family. He had no political connections. He didn't write poetry or debate philosophy in the salons of Constantinople. He was just good at the one thing the empire desperately needed, winning battles. And the empire needed that more than it wanted to admit. Because by the time Belisarius reached his 20s, Byzantium was losing everywhere. The Persians pressed from the east. Barbarians raided from the north. The Mediterranean, Rome's ancient lake, the sea that had connected the empire for centuries, was now controlled by enemies. Then came Justinian, a peasant's nephew who clawed his way to the throne with intelligence, ruthlessness, and an obsession that would define an era. He looked at the map and saw not what was, but what should be. He saw the old Roman Empire, waiting to be reclaimed. And he saw Belisarius, a young general who won battles he shouldn't win, who turned disasters into victories with nothing but discipline and tactical genius. Justinian needed a weapon. Belisarius needed a purpose. What happened next would reshape the Mediterranean world. The question was whether either of them would survive it. Thrace was the kind of place that produced two things reliably: grain and soldiers. The land stretched between the Danube and Constantinople, a buffer zone that had absorbed invasions for centuries. Mountains rose in the west, rivers cut through the plains, and every generation grew up knowing that survival meant being harder than the next wave of barbarians coming over the horizon. Belisarius was born into this world around the year 500, give or take a few years. The records don't specify. Byzantium kept meticulous accounts of tax revenue and church donations, but the birth of a Thracian peasant boy didn't warrant an entry in anyone's ledger. His family probably worked the land, raised horses, and sent their sons to the army when they came of age. It was the pattern. It had been the pattern for generations. The Thrace of Belisarius's childhood wasn't peaceful. The frontier never was. Huns raided from across the Danube. Slavic tribes tested the borders. Gothic federates, technically allied with Byzantium but loyal to no one, moved through the region like wolves, taking what they wanted. The imperial army was spread thin, corrupt, and often useless. Local communities defended themselves or died. This environment created a specific kind of person, practical, disciplined, skeptical of grand promises, and comfortable with violence. Thracian soldiers had a reputation throughout the empire. They weren't refined. They didn't quote Homer or debate the nature of Christ's divinity, but they could march 30 miles in a day, fight a battle, and do it again tomorrow. The empire despised them and desperately needed them in equal measure. Belisarius learned to ride before he was 10. In Thrace, that wasn't a luxury. It was survival. Horses meant mobility, and mobility meant you could see enemies coming and run if necessary. He learned to handle weapons the way other boys learned to plow fields. A sword wasn't a symbol of status. It was a tool like a hammer or a sickle, and you kept it sharp because your life might depend on it. The Byzantine army recruited constantly from the region. The pay was irregular and the conditions were brutal, but it was better than starving through another winter. Young men joined, marched east to fight Persians or north to guard the frontier, and either came back with money or didn't come back at all. The ones who survived learned the essential skills of Byzantine military life: how to follow orders, how to stay alive in hostile territory, and how to navigate the corruption that defined every level of the system. Belisarius joined sometime in his teens. The exact year is lost, like most details of his early life. He wasn't officer material, not at first. No family connections, no political patron, no aristocratic bloodline. He started as a common soldier. One more body in the formation and the empire had thousands of those. But the empire didn't have thousands of people who were genuinely competent. Byzantine military culture in the early 6th century was a study in contradictions. On paper, it was the most sophisticated fighting force in the world. The Romans had been perfecting warfare for centuries, and Byzantium inherited all that knowledge: tactical manuals, engineering expertise, logistical systems that could supply armies across continents. The empire had professional soldiers, fortified cities, a navy that controlled the seas. In practice, it was a disaster. Generals bought their positions through political connections. Officers stole supplies and pocketed the soldiers' pay. Campaigns failed because commanders were too busy scheming against each other to focus on the actual enemy. The army that had once conquered the Mediterranean had become a corrupt, inefficient machine that lost battles it should have won. Belisarius didn't fit into this system, and that's probably what saved him. He wasn't interested in politics. He didn't network with senators or flatter eunuchs in the palace. He just did the work. When officers gave orders, he followed them. When formations needed discipline, he enforced it. When battles needed winning, he figured out how to win them. This sounds simple, but in Byzantine military culture, it was revolutionary. He rose through the ranks slowly at first, then faster as people noticed. A young officer who actually knew how to organize a supply line. a commander who could maintain discipline without resorting to constant executions, a tactician who studied the enemy instead of just charging forward and hoping for the best. The Thracian frontier gave him something the aristocratic generals from Constantinople never had: real experience against real enemies. The raids and skirmishes along the Danube weren't glorious set-piece battles. They were ugly, confused fights where victory meant not dying and defeat meant your village burned. Belisarius learned to read terrain, to anticipate enemy movements, to recognize when a fight was winnable and when retreat was the smarter option. He also learned something else, something that would define his entire career. Loyalty to the state mattered more than personal ambition. This seems obvious, but in Byzantium it was almost unheard of. Every general with an army was a potential usurper. Every successful campaign made the emperor nervous. The history of Rome was filled with commanders who marched on the capital and seized power. Belisarius never did that. Even when he had the chance, even when his soldiers begged him to, even when refusing meant losing everything, his loyalty was absolute, irrational, almost pathological. It would save the empire multiple times. It would also destroy him in the end. But that came later. In the 520s, he was still rising, still proving himself. The Persian War was brewing in the east, and Byzantium needed commanders who could actually fight. The emperor at the time was Justin, an illiterate soldier who had clawed his way from the Balkan peasantry to the throne. Justin understood the value of competent men, probably because he had been one himself. More importantly, Justin's nephew was watching. Justinian wasn't emperor yet, but everyone knew he would be. He was the one actually running the government, pulling strings, making decisions, and he had a vision. A dangerous, expensive, probably impossible vision of restoring the Roman Empire to its ancient glory. For that vision, he needed a weapon, a general who could win against impossible odds, someone loyal enough to trust with an army, but not ambitious enough to become a threat, someone who came from nothing and owed everything to the state. He found that person in a Thracian soldier who had spent his entire life learning how to fight, how to survive, and how to serve. Belisarius was 25 years old when he caught Justinian's attention. Within 5 years, he would reconquer a kingdom. Within 10, he would save the empire from collapse. Within 20, he would be arrested, humiliated, and nearly erased from history. But first, he had to win a battle that everyone thought was unwinnable. The Persians were coming, and they brought the largest army the East had seen in generations. The stage was set, the empire was crumbling, and one general from the frontier was about to change everything. The Byzantine military system in the 520s was like a magnificent building with rotten foundations. From the outside it looked impressive. Uniforms, ranks, ceremonies, all the trappings of Roman military tradition. Inside, it was falling apart. Officers bought their commissions with bribes. Soldiers went months without pay. Equipment disappeared into the black market before it reached the front lines, and commanders spent more time plotting against each other than fighting the empire's actual enemies. Belisarius entered this world as a junior officer, and his first lesson was simple. Competence was dangerous. If you did your job too well, you made other people look bad. If you won battles, you became a threat. If you showed loyalty, people assumed you were stupid or hiding something. The system rewarded mediocrity and punished excellence, which explained why Byzantium was losing wars it should have won. But Belisarius had an advantage that no one expected. He didn't care about the politics. He wasn't from Constantinople. He had no family connections to protect, no aristocratic reputation to maintain, no ambitions beyond serving the empire. This made him incomprehensible to the officer corps, most of whom had spent their entire careers networking, flattering, and scheming their way up the ladder. He just did the work. When his unit was assigned to garrison duty on the eastern frontier, he actually maintained discipline. Soldiers showed up for drills, equipment was accounted for, patrols followed their routes instead of sitting in taverns. This sounds basic, but in the Byzantine army, it was practically revolutionary. Other commanders noticed, mostly because his soldiers weren't deserting or mutinying, which was the standard outcome for most postings. The eastern frontier in the 520s was a nightmare. Persia had been Rome's great rival for centuries, and the border between the two empires was a constant low-level war zone. Raids, skirmishes, diplomatic incidents that escalated into massacres. The Sassanid Persians were organized, disciplined, and led by a king, Kavad I, who actually knew what he was doing. Byzantium, by contrast, was led by a rotating cast of incompetent generals who owed their positions to political connections rather than military skill. Belisarius spent several years on this frontier, learning the patterns of Persian warfare. They favored heavy cavalry, armored horsemen who could punch through infantry lines. They used combined arms tactics, coordinating archers with cavalry charges. They were patient, methodical, and they didn't make the kinds of stupid mistakes that Byzantine commanders made constantly. He studied them, not just their tactics, but their mindset. How they thought about terrain, how they organized their supply lines, how they reacted under pressure. Most Byzantine officers treated the Persians with a mixture of contempt and fear. Contempt because they were barbarians, fear because they kept winning. Belisarius treated them as a problem to solve, and problems always had solutions if you looked hard enough. His breakthrough came during a minor skirmish near the city of Dara. A Persian raiding party had crossed the border and was harassing Byzantine territory. The local commander ordered a pursuit, which was standard procedure and usually a disaster. Byzantine cavalry would chase the Persians into an ambush, get slaughtered, and the survivors would retreat in chaos. Belisarius was commanding a small detachment that day. Instead of charging blindly after the raiders, he did something different. He thought about it. The Persians wanted to be chased. The whole point of the raid was to draw Byzantine forces out of position, so he didn't chase them. He positioned his cavalry between the raiders and their escape route, then waited. The Persians, expecting a pursuit, found themselves cut off. They had to fight on ground they didn't choose, and they lost. It wasn't a major victory, maybe 50 dead on each side, but the tactics were sound. Belisarius had turned the Persians' own strategy against them, and he'd done it with minimal losses. Word traveled. In an army full of disasters, even a small success stood out. More importantly, the right people heard about it. Justinian was still officially just the emperor's nephew, but everyone knew he ran the government. Justin I was old, illiterate, and content to let his brilliant nephew handle the details of administration. Justinian had a vision for the empire: restoration, reconquest, a return to Rome's ancient glory. But visions required resources, and the most important resource was competent commanders. The empire didn't have many of those. Most generals were aristocrats who bought their positions and treated warfare as a political opportunity. They commanded armies the way other people collected art, for status, not because they knew what they were doing. Justinian needed something different. He needed a professional, someone who understood that winning battles required more than just showing up with an army. He started asking questions about the young officer from Thrace who had actually won a skirmish without losing half his men in the process. Who was this Belisarius? Where did he come from? Could he be trusted? The answers weren't impressive on paper. No family connections, no aristocratic bloodline, no political faction backing him, but there was something else, something that mattered more to Justinian. Belisarius won fights, not through luck or overwhelming numbers, but through actual tactical competence. and he did it without trying to turn his victories into political leverage. In Byzantium, that was rarer than gold. Justinian arranged a meeting. The details are lost. No one bothered to record what they said to each other that first time, but the outcome was clear. Justinian saw a weapon he could use. Belisarius saw a purpose larger than himself. The partnership began. It wasn't based on friendship. Justinian didn't have friends, he had tools. And Belisarius didn't need friendship, he needed a mission. What they had was an understanding. Justinian would give Belisarius armies and campaigns. Belisarius would deliver victories. Neither of them trusted the other completely, but trust wasn't the point. Results were the point. The first test came quickly. Persia and Byzantium were sliding toward open war again, which happened every few decades like clockwork. King Kavod wanted to revise the border agreements. Justinian refused. Diplomatic negotiations collapsed. Armies mobilized. Byzantium sent a massive force east, commanded by the usual collection of aristocratic generals who spent most of their time arguing about precedence and strategy. Belisarius was part of the expedition, but he wasn't in command. Not yet. He was still too junior, too unknown, too lacking in the political credentials that Byzantium valued more than actual competence. The campaign was a disaster. Persian forces outmaneuvered the Byzantine army at every turn. Supplies ran out. Commanders bickered. Soldiers deserted. The entire expedition nearly collapsed before a single major battle was fought. It was classic Byzantine military incompetence, and everyone knew it. Except Belisarius kept his section of the army functional. While other units fell apart, his men stayed disciplined. While supplies disappeared everywhere else, he managed to keep his soldiers fed. While morale collapsed across the front, his troops remained ready to fight. Justinian noticed, so did the other commanders, though they didn't know what to make of it. Here was an officer who actually maintained standards, who treated warfare as a profession rather than a political opportunity. It was unsettling. It didn't fit the pattern. The campaign ended inconclusively, which in Byzantine terms meant it was a defeat. Both sides withdrew. Diplomats negotiated a temporary peace. The generals returned to Constantinople to write reports blaming each other for the failure. But something had changed. Justinian now knew that he had at least one commander who could actually command, and Belisarius had proven that discipline and competence could survive even in the chaos of a Byzantine military disaster. The next war was coming. Everyone knew it. The peace treaty with Persia was just a pause, a chance for both sides to rearm and prepare. When the fighting started again, Justinian would need someone to lead the army, someone who could win. He chose Belisarius, not because of political connections or aristocratic bloodline, but because the Thracian soldier had done something almost unheard of in the Byzantine military. He had been competent, consistently without excuses. The appointment shocked the aristocracy. Who was this nobody from the provinces? Why was he being given command over men with far better credentials? The whispers started immediately. Justinian was making a mistake. The young general would fail. The campaign would collapse. They were wrong. Belisarius was about to fight a battle that would make him famous across two empires. The Persians were gathering the largest army they'd assembled in a generation, and they were coming to the fortress city of Dara with the intention of crushing Byzantine power in the east once and for all. Belisarius had 15,000 men. The Persians had 40,000. The mathematics was brutal. Every tactical manual said he should retreat, abandon the city, and wait for reinforcements that would never come. He didn't retreat. He had a better idea. Dara sat on the eastern edge of the Byzantine Empire like a brick in the throat of Persia. The fortress city had been built 50 years earlier specifically to counter Persian power, and its location said everything about the relationship between the two empires. It was close, too close to the Persian border, a constant reminder that Byzantium refused to back down. In the summer of 529, the Persians decided to do something about it. King Kavad sent his best general, a man named Perozes, with an army that Byzantine scouts estimated at 40,000 men. The numbers might have been exaggerated. Armies always looked bigger when they were coming to kill you. But even conservative estimates put the Persian force at nearly 3 times the size of Belisarius's garrison. Perozes had cavalry, archers, infantry, siege equipment, and the confidence of a commander who had never lost a major battle. Belisarius had 15,000 men, a fortress city that couldn't withstand a prolonged siege, and a reputation he was still building. He also had something the Persians didn't expect. He'd been thinking about this fight for years. The Persians approached Dara in early June, their army spreading across the plain like a dark flood. The sight must have been terrifying. 40,000 men marching in formation, banners flying, armor glinting in the sun, the thunder of hooves and boots, the creaking of siege engines, the sounds of an empire on the move. Persian forces had crushed Byzantine armies before. This looked like it would be another massacre. Inside Dara, Belisarius watched them come. His officers waited for the order to man the walls, to prepare for a siege, to do what every Byzantine commander had done when faced with superior numbers: hide behind fortifications and pray for reinforcements. Instead, Belisarius ordered his army to march out of the city. The reaction was immediate. His officers thought he'd lost his mind. March out to meet the Persians in open battle, with 1/3 their numbers? It was suicide. Basic military mathematics said you needed numerical superiority to win a pitched battle. Belisarius had numerical inferiority, significant numerical inferiority, the kind that turned battles into slaughters. But he'd been studying the terrain around Dara for weeks, and he'd noticed something. About a mile north of the city, there was a small stream, barely worth calling a river, that ran east to west across the plain. The stream itself wasn't deep enough to stop an army, but the banks were steep in places, and the ground on the north side was slightly elevated. Not much, maybe 10 feet at most, but 10 feet could matter if you used it correctly. Belisarius marched his army to that stream and started digging. The Persians watched with what must have been amusement. The Byzantines were fortifying a position in the open field. They were digging trenches, building earthworks, turning a minor geographical feature into something that looked almost like a defensive line. It was creative, certainly, but it didn't change the fundamental mathematics. 40,000 men would roll over 15,000, no matter how clever the fortifications. Perozes sent a message. It was polite, almost friendly. The Persian general complimented Belisarius on his courage in accepting battle. He admired the defensive preparations. Very professional. But surely the Byzantine commander understood the situation. The numbers were overwhelming. Men were going to die, a lot of men for no purpose. Perhaps there could be an arrangement. Perhaps Dara could surrender with honor, and the bloodshed could be avoided. Belisarius sent back a one-sentence reply: "We will meet you on the field." The Persian response came the next day. Perozes formed his army into battle order and advanced toward the Byzantine position. This was it, the formal challenge. In ancient warfare, there were rituals to these things. Armies lined up, sent champions forward to exchange insults, built up the tension before the actual killing started. The Persians were following the script. Belisarius didn't. When the Persian champions rode forward to issue their challenge, Byzantine archers shot them. Not dramatically, not after a long exchange of threats, just arrows in the chest, horses collapsing, bodies hitting the ground. The message was clear. This wasn't going to be a glorious, honorable battle. It was going to be ugly. The Persians pulled back, regrouped, and sent another message. This time it wasn't polite. Perozes promised that after the battle, every Byzantine soldier would be crucified along the road to Dara. Their families would be enslaved. The city would be burned. Byzantium would learn what happened to empires that forgot their place. Belisarius didn't respond. He just watched the Persian army from his position behind the stream, counting units, noting formations, calculating angles and distances. His officers stood beside him, nervous, waiting for some indication that their general had a plan beyond getting them all killed. He did have a plan, but explaining it wouldn't help. His officers needed to see it work. The real battle began on the third day. Perozes had spent 2 days trying to intimidate the Byzantines into retreat or surrender, and neither had worked. Now he was angry, and angry commanders made mistakes. He ordered the full Persian army forward in a massive frontal assault. The plan was simple: use overwhelming numbers to crush the Byzantine center, then encircle the flanks and destroy the entire force. It was the kind of strategy that worked when you had a 3-to-1 numerical advantage. The Persians advanced in waves. First the infantry, armored spearmen moving in tight formation, then the cavalry, heavy horsemen in scale armor, the shock troops that had broken Byzantine lines 100 times before. Behind them, archers, ready to provide covering fire. It was textbook Persian tactics, and it had been winning battles for centuries. Belisarius watched them come. When they reached the stream, the first wave hesitated. The banks were steeper than they looked from a distance. Not impassable, but awkward. Soldiers had to slow down, pick their way across, reform on the other side. The Persian formation, so neat at a distance, started to fracture. That's when the Byzantine archers opened fire. Belisarius had positioned his archers on the elevated ground behind the stream, with clear sightlines to the crossing points. The Persians, focused on getting across the stream and maintaining formation, were exposed. Arrows fell like rain, not wildly, not in the desperate volleys of a panicked army, but in controlled, disciplined waves. Target the officers, target the cavalry horses, target anyone trying to organize the crossing. The Persian advance stalled. Men were dying before they could even engage the Byzantine line. Perozes sent more troops forward, trying to force the crossing through sheer numbers. More bodies in the stream, more arrows finding targets. The water turned red, but numbers mattered. Even with heavy casualties, the Persians were getting across. Their cavalry was forming up on the Byzantine side of the stream, preparing to charge. Once those heavy horsemen hit the Byzantine center, the defensive line would shatter. Everyone knew it. The Persian commanders knew it. Belisarius's officers knew it. Belisarius had known it from the beginning. That's why the defensive line wasn't the real plan. As the Persian cavalry prepared to charge, Byzantine cavalry units that had been hidden on the flanks, concealed by the terrain and the earthworks, moved into position. They didn't charge forward. They didn't try to meet the Persians head-on. They moved laterally, closing in from the sides, trapping the Persian cavalry between the Byzantine center and the flanking units. It was a hammer and anvil. The Persian cavalry, expecting to crush the Byzantine infantry, suddenly found themselves surrounded. They couldn't maneuver. They couldn't retreat back across the stream without exposing themselves to more archery. They couldn't advance because the Byzantine center was holding. Perozes saw what was happening and tried to send reinforcements, but his army was now divided by the stream, with half his forces on one side and half on the other. Communication broke down. Units stopped coordinating. The neat Persian formations dissolved into chaos. The Byzantine flanking cavalry charged. Not a wild, heroic charge, but a calculated assault on an enemy that couldn't properly defend itself. The Persian cavalry, the elite shock troops that were supposed to win the battle, were being cut to pieces. Perozes made one last attempt to salvage the situation. He pulled his forces back across the stream, reformed them on the south side, and prepared for another assault. But his army was bleeding. Morale was cracking, and every soldier could see that the Byzantines, the outnumbered, supposedly doomed Byzantines, had just stopped the Persian attack cold. The sun was setting. The battle had lasted all day, and Belisarius still held the field. That night, both armies regrouped. The Persians had taken brutal casualties, maybe 5,000 dead, another 10,000 wounded. The Byzantines had lost men too, but far fewer. More importantly, they'd proven something that the Persian Empire hadn't believed possible. Byzantium could win. Perozes sent no more messages that night. No threats, no offers, just silence across the field. The battle would resume in the morning, but something had changed. The Persians now knew they were in a real fight, and Belisarius had proven that genius mattered more than numbers. At least it mattered if you used it correctly. To understand what Belisarius did at Dara, you need to understand what he was working with. The Byzantine army of 529 wasn't the legions of ancient Rome. Those disciplined formations that conquered the Mediterranean were centuries dead. What Belisarius commanded was something messier, more complicated, and in some ways more interesting. His 15,000 men were a mixed force. About half were regular Byzantine infantry, professional soldiers, mostly from the Balkans and Anatolia, who trained together and understood basic formations. The other half was cavalry, and here's where it got complicated. Some were Byzantine heavy cavalry, armored horsemen who could match the Persian cataphracts in a direct fight. Others were Huns, recruited from the steppes, light cavalry who fought with bows and hit-and-run tactics. There were also Federati, barbarian mercenaries who fought for pay, and had their own ideas about discipline. Getting these different groups to work together was like conducting an orchestra where half the musicians spoke different languages and the other half didn't particularly like each other. Roman infantry despised barbarian cavalry. Heavy cavalry looked down on light cavalry. Everyone distrusted the mercenaries, and all of them knew they were outnumbered 3-1 by an enemy that had been winning wars for generations. Belisarius couldn't change the numbers, but he could change how the numbers were used. The traditional Byzantine approach to battle was simple. Form up infantry in the center, put cavalry on the flanks, charge forward, and hope for the best. It worked when you had numerical superiority. It was a disaster when you didn't. So he did something different. He started with the terrain. That stream north of Dara was the key. It wasn't much, maybe 15 feet wide, 3 feet deep in most places, but the banks were steep enough to slow an advancing army. Soldiers would have to break formation to cross, then reform on the other side. That moment of disorder, when men were focused on their footing rather than the enemy, was a vulnerability. Belisarius intended to exploit it. He spent 2 days before the battle having his men dig. Not just simple trenches, but a sophisticated system of earthworks that turned a minor geographical feature into a defensive maze. The stream itself was widened in places, making the banks steeper. Small ditches were dug on the Byzantine side, creating uneven ground that would disrupt a cavalry charge. Earth from the ditches was piled up to create elevated positions for archers. The result was a defensive line that looked modest from a distance, but was actually a series of interlocking obstacles. An attacking force would have to slow down, bunch up, expose themselves, all while under fire from archers who had clear sightlines and stable ground to shoot from. But the real genius wasn't the earthworks, it was the deployment behind them. Belisarius positioned his infantry in the center, directly behind the stream. They were arranged in a checkerboard formation rather than a solid line. This seemed counterintuitive. Traditional wisdom said you wanted a continuous front to prevent breakthroughs, but the gaps between units served a purpose. They allowed Byzantine cavalry to move through the infantry line quickly, shifting position without getting tangled in their own formations. The heavy cavalry was split into two groups, positioned on the flanks but slightly behind the infantry line. This placement looked defensive, maybe even timid. The Persians would see it and assume the Byzantines were keeping their cavalry in reserve, ready to plug gaps if the infantry broke. They'd be wrong. The cavalry was positioned for encirclement. The light cavalry, mostly Huns, were placed even further back, completely hidden by the terrain and the earthworks. From the Persian side of the stream, they were invisible. This was critical. Belisarius needed the Persians to commit to their attack before revealing his full strength. And then there were the archers. Byzantine military doctrine had always emphasized archery, but most armies used archers as support troops. You'd shoot a few volleys, maybe disrupt the enemy formation, then the real fighting would happen hand to hand. Belisarius had a different approach. He positioned his archers where they could deliver sustained, accurate fire throughout the entire battle, not just during the opening phase, but continuously for hours if necessary. The key was elevation and protection. Archers on the elevated ground behind the stream had a clear field of fire. The earthworks protected them from return fire, and they were organized in rotations, one group shooting while another knocked arrows, so the rate of fire never dropped. It wasn't about individual heroic archery. It was about creating a constant rain of arrows that never stopped. When the Persians attacked on the third day, they followed their standard playbook. Infantry in front to engage the enemy line and pin them in place. Heavy cavalry behind, waiting for the moment to charge and break the Byzantine center. Archers in the rear to provide covering fire. It was a proven strategy. It should have worked. The Persian infantry hit the stream and the plan started to fall apart. They were too bunched up. The crossing points were narrow, and men were jostling each other, trying to maintain formation on unstable ground. Officers shouted orders, but the noise and confusion drowned out coordination. By the time they reached the Byzantine side of the stream, the neat Persian formations had degraded into clumps of soldiers trying to organize themselves while under fire. The Byzantine archers were already shooting, not randomly, but with specific targets. Officers first, the men shouting orders and trying to reform the ranks. Then cavalry horses, because a dismounted heavy cavalryman was just a man in very heavy armor. Then anyone who looked like they were organizing a cohesive unit. The goal wasn't to kill everyone. It was to prevent the Persians from coordinating their attack. The Persian infantry did eventually engage the Byzantine center. It was brutal, close quarters fighting with spears and shields. The Byzantine infantry held, but barely. They were outnumbered, and Persian soldiers were professionals who knew their business. The line bent. Units started to buckle. In a traditional battle, this would be the moment when the defensive line broke and the battle turned into a rout. But Belisarius wasn't fighting a traditional battle. The bending center was part of the plan. As the Persian infantry pushed forward, they exposed their flanks. They were focused on the fight directly in front of them, the natural human instinct in combat, and they didn't notice the Byzantine heavy cavalry moving into position on either side. The cavalry had advanced through the gaps in the infantry formation, using the checkerboard deployment to move forward without disrupting their own line. When the Persian heavy cavalry tried to follow their infantry across the stream, they found themselves in a kill zone. Byzantine archers concentrated fire on the crossing points. The Persian horses balked at the steep banks, disrupting the charge before it even began. And when they finally made it across, they were met not by a collapsing Byzantine center, but by a coordinated pincer movement from the flanking cavalry. The Persians were trapped, They couldn't advance because the Byzantine infantry was holding. They couldn't retreat because their own forces were still pushing from behind, trying to cross the stream. And they were taking casualties from 3 directions: arrows from above, cavalry charges from the sides, and infantry pressure from the front. Perozes tried to compensate by sending more troops forward, but he was making the classic mistake of reinforcing failure. Every additional unit he sent across the stream just added to the chaos. The crossing points became choked with men and horses, making them even more vulnerable to archery. Communication broke down completely. Officers on one side of the stream couldn't coordinate with officers on the other side. That's when Belisarius released the Hun cavalry. They'd been waiting, invisible, for exactly this moment, when the Persian formation was completely disrupted, when their attention was focused on the center and flanks. The light cavalry swept around from the rear. They didn't engage in close combat. They didn't need to. They just rode along the edges of the Persian force, shooting arrows, creating panic, making it impossible for the Persians to reform or retreat in good order. It was chaos, but it was controlled chaos. Belisarius had planned for this. His officers knew their roles. The different units, Roman infantry, Byzantine heavy cavalry, Hun light cavalry, were coordinating despite their differences because they'd been drilled on this exact scenario. Not improvisation, preparation. By sunset, the Persian army was in full retreat. They'd lost thousands of men, and the survivors were demoralized. The invincible Persian military machine had been beaten by an outnumbered Byzantine force, not through luck or divine intervention, but through superior tactics and discipline. The next morning, Perozes pulled his remaining forces back from Dara. There would be no siege, no triumphant entry into the city, just a long, humiliating march back to Persian territory with an army that had learned a hard lesson. Numbers alone didn't guarantee victory. News of the battle spread across both empires. In Constantinople, Justinian received reports with the kind of satisfaction that comes from betting on the right horse. Belisarius had done exactly what was needed, won a battle that no one thought could be won. In Persia, the defeat sent shockwaves through the military establishment. How had this happened? How had a provincial Byzantine general outmaneuvered their best commander? The answer was simple, but hard to accept. Belisarius treated warfare as a science, not an art. He studied terrain, calculated angles, anticipated enemy moves, and prepared contingencies. He didn't rely on courage or morale or divine favor. He relied on math, physics, and psychology. He turned battle into a problem that could be solved if you thought about it hard enough. And he just solved a very big problem. Dara made Belisarius famous. It also made him dangerous. In Byzantium, successful generals were always potential threats. Justinian now had a weapon that could win battles, but weapons could be turned against their owners. The question was whether Belisarius could be trusted with power. The answer would come sooner than anyone expected, because within 3 years Constantinople would burn, and the emperor would need that weapon more desperately than he'd ever imagined. Constantinople in January of 532 was the richest city in the world, and it was tearing itself apart. The streets that usually hummed with commerce and gossip now echoed with screams and the crash of breaking glass. Fires burned in a dozen districts. Bodies lay in the avenues. And in the Hippodrome, the massive arena that could hold 100,000 spectators, a mob had just proclaimed a new emperor. This wasn't supposed to happen. Constantinople was the heart of civilization, the center of Roman power, the city that had survived everything from barbarian invasions to earthquakes. It had walls 40 feet thick. It had a professional guard. It had centuries of imperial tradition holding it together. And yet here it was, 5 days into a riot that had become a revolution, and Justinian was preparing to flee. The trouble started with chariot racing. which sounds absurd until you understand what chariot racing meant in Byzantine culture. The races weren't just entertainment. They were politics, religion, and tribal identity rolled into one. The two main factions, the Blues and the Greens, weren't just fan clubs. They were organized political movements with their own militias, their own territories in the city, their own networks of patronage and power. The Blues generally supported the emperor and represented the orthodox religious establishment. The Greens were more populist, more willing to challenge authority. For years, the factions had engaged in street violence, small-scale riots, the occasional murder. The government tolerated it because the factions also provided muscle for controlling the city, informal enforcers who kept their neighborhoods in line. But in January of 532, something changed. Justinian's government arrested several faction members for murder and sentenced them to execution. During the hangings, the scaffolding broke. 2 men, one blue, one green, survived the fall and took sanctuary in a church. The factions demanded clemency. Justinian refused. On January 13th, during the chariot races at the Hippodrome, both factions started chanting together, "Nika! Nika! Nika! Victory! Victory! Victory!" It was their racing cry, but now it meant something different. The mob poured out of the Hippodrome and into the streets. What happened next was chaos that followed a pattern. The mob attacked government buildings. They burned the tax office, which everyone in Constantinople hated because tax collectors were corrupt and brutal. They burned the city prefect's headquarters. They broke into prisons and released inmates. The violence had a direction. It was aimed at the government, at Justinian's officials, at the system that everyone felt was squeezing them. Justinian tried negotiation. He offered to pardon the condemned men. The mob ignored him. He dismissed unpopular officials. The mob kept burning buildings. He appeared at the Hippodrome personally, holding a copy of the Gospels, promising reforms. The crowd nearly killed him. By the 5th day, a third of the city was on fire. The mob had grown to maybe 50,000 people. Rioters, opportunists, genuine revolutionaries, and citizens who were just angry about decades of corruption and high taxes. And they'd found a new emperor. Hypatius, nephew of a former emperor, hadn't wanted the job. The mob dragged him to the Hippodrome and crowned him anyway. Now there were 2 emperors in Constantinople, and the city wasn't big enough for both. In the palace, Justinian's advisors were unanimous: flee. The situation was hopeless. The palace guard couldn't control a mob this size. The army units stationed in Constantinople were unreliable. Many soldiers sympathized with the rioters. If Justinian stayed, he'd be killed. If he left, he could raise loyal forces from the provinces, return with an army, and retake the city later. It was the logical move. It was also surrender. An emperor who fled from a mob wasn't really an emperor anymore. He was just a man running for his life. Justinian knew this, but he was ready to do it anyway. He'd ordered ships prepared in the harbor. The plan was to leave that night. Then Theodora spoke. Theodora was Justinian's wife, and calling her unconventional was putting it mildly. She'd been an actress and possibly a prostitute before marrying the emperor, scandalous origins that the aristocracy never let her forget. But she had something the aristocrats didn't, a spine made of iron. While Justinian wavered, she made her position clear. "Those who have worn the crown should never survive its loss," she said. "If you want to flee, the ships are ready. But I'm staying. Purple makes an excellent burial shroud." It was a challenge and a condemnation. Justinian could run if he wanted, but he'd be abandoning not just the throne, but any claim to be taken seriously as a ruler. Theodora was staying, and if he left while she remained, he'd never live it down. The room went silent. Then Justinian turned to Belisarius. The general had been in the capital for barely a month, fresh from campaigns in the east. He'd come to Constantinople for recognition, rewards, maybe a triumph. Instead, he found himself in the palace with an emperor on the verge of collapse and a city that wanted to burn itself down. Justinian's question was simple: can you stop this? Belisarius looked at the situation with the same detachment he'd used at Dara. A mob of 50,000 holding the Hippodrome. Most of the city's guard units compromised or unavailable. No time to raise reinforcements from outside. No political solution. Hypatius was already crowned, and the mob wouldn't accept Justinian's authority anymore. The only option was military. A direct assault on the Hippodrome. Kill enough people that the rest would scatter. It was brutal. Probably a massacre. Definitely the kind of thing that would haunt everyone involved. But it would work. "Give me a few hours," Belisarius said. He left the palace with 2 other generals, Mundus, a loyal officer who commanded Gothic federates, and Narses, a eunuch who controlled a contingent of Herulian mercenaries. Between them, they had maybe 3,000 troops, against 50,000 rioters. The mathematics were worse than Dara, and at Dara the enemy had at least been organized. But Belisarius had learned something in his years of warfare. Numbers mattered less than psychology. A mob of 50,000 sounded terrifying, but it wasn't an army. It was thousands of individuals who'd been swept up in the moment, most of whom had no real combat training. They were dangerous because they were a crowd, but crowds broke differently than armies. You just had to find the right pressure point. The Hippodrome had several entrances, but most were blocked or controlled by the mob. Belisarius identified 2 gates that were less defended, side entrances that the rioters had ignored because they were focused on the main approaches. He split his forces. Mundus would take the Gothic federates through one gate. Belisarius would take his own troops through another. Narses and the Herulians would seal off the exits to prevent escape. The plan was simple: hit the mob from 2 directions simultaneously, create panic, and cut down anyone who fought back. Don't give them time to organize. Don't let them realize that the soldiers were vastly outnumbered. Just attack, keep attacking, and rely on fear to do the rest. They moved into position as the sun set. Inside the Hippodrome, the mob was celebrating. They'd won. They had a new emperor. Constantinople was theirs. Some were probably drunk. Others were just exhausted from 5 days of rioting. No one expected an attack. Why would they? The imperial forces had been passive for days. Belisarius gave the signal. His troops poured through the side gates, shields locked, swords out. The mob near the entrance saw them too late. The soldiers didn't hesitate. They just started killing. On the other side of the Hippodrome, Mundus and the Goths did the same. The mob was caught between 2 professional military units that were trained to kill efficiently and were now doing exactly that. The celebration turned into panic. People tried to run, but the exits were blocked. Others tried to fight, grabbing whatever weapons they could find, but they were facing soldiers who'd spent their entire lives training for combat. It was a slaughter. The soldiers pushed deeper into the Hippodrome, cutting down anyone in their path. The mob broke. Not all at once, some tried to resist, forming desperate knots of resistance. But the psychological advantage was with the soldiers. A professional military formation, moving with discipline and purpose, is terrifying. A mob, no matter how large, can't match that kind of organized violence. The killing went on for hours. Bodies piled up in the corridors. The sand of the racing track turned red. People begged for mercy. The soldiers didn't give it. Belisarius had ordered them to keep going until the Hippodrome was cleared, and they followed orders. By dawn, it was over. Estimates vary, but somewhere between 30,000 and 50,000 people died that night. Most were rioters, but there were also innocent bystanders. People who'd come to the Hippodrome because they didn't know what else to do. Citizens who were just in the wrong place when the soldiers arrived. Hypatius, the reluctant emperor, was captured and executed the next day. His body was thrown into the sea. The mob's leaders were hunted down over the following weeks. The factions were suppressed. Constantinople, burned and traumatized, slowly returned to order. Justinian remained emperor. Theodora had been right. Purple did make an excellent burial shroud, but it was everyone else who wore it. The imperial couple had survived by being willing to drown a revolution in blood, and Belisarius had proven something darker than his victory at Dara. He wasn't just a military genius. He was a tool that could be used for anything, against Persians, against rioters, against his own people if necessary. He followed orders. He delivered results. He didn't ask moral questions. Justinian now knew exactly how useful and how dangerous that kind of loyalty could be. The general who saved Constantinople would be rewarded, but he'd also be watched more carefully than ever before, because a man who could stop a revolution could also start one. And in Byzantium, that possibility never left the emperor's mind. North Africa had been Roman for 700 years. It was the breadbasket of the empire, the land that fed Rome with grain shipped from Carthage and Alexandria. Olive groves stretched for miles. Cities dotted the coastline, connected by roads the legions had built centuries earlier. It was wealthy, productive, and crucial to any empire that wanted to control the Mediterranean. Then the Vandals arrived. In 439, a Germanic tribe crossed from Spain into Africa and carved out a kingdom that would last a century. They took Carthage, the greatest city in the Western Mediterranean. They built a fleet and turned piracy into state policy, raiding Italy, Sicily, even sacking Rome itself in 455. By the time Justinian became emperor, the Vandal kingdom was an established power, and North Africa was lost. Justinian wanted it back. This wasn't sentiment, it was strategy. Byzantium needed North African grain to feed Constantinople. It needed control of the Mediterranean shipping lanes. And it needed to prove that the Roman Empire could still expand, could still reclaim what had been lost. Justinian's entire political identity was built on restoration, bringing back the old empire, reasserting Roman dominance. North Africa was the test case. In 533, he ordered the invasion, and he gave command to Belisarius. The reaction in Constantinople was mixed. On one hand, Belisarius had proven himself at Dara and during the Nika riots. He was loyal, competent, and capable of winning against impossible odds. On the other hand, this was different. Dara was a defensive battle on Byzantine soil. The riots were urban combat in a city he knew. North Africa was an amphibious invasion across hostile waters, followed by a campaign in unfamiliar territory against an enemy that had held the region for nearly a century. The logistics alone were staggering. Belisarius would need to transport an army across the Mediterranean, establish a beachhead, secure supply lines, and then march inland to confront the Vandals, all while operating hundreds of miles from Byzantine territory. If the fleet was destroyed or the invasion failed, there would be no reinforcements, no retreat. The army would be stranded in hostile territory and destroyed. It was the kind of campaign that could break an empire if it went wrong. And the historical precedent wasn't encouraging. The previous Byzantine attempt to retake Africa, nearly 80 years earlier, had been a catastrophic failure that bankrupted the treasury and accomplished nothing. But Justinian was convinced, and Belisarius, as always, followed orders. The army that assembled in Constantinople in June of 533 was smaller than anyone expected. 15,000 infantry, maybe 5,000 cavalry, 20,000 men total to conquer a kingdom. It sounds insane until you realize that Belisarius never relied on numbers. He relied on speed, discipline, and the kind of tactical flexibility that let a small professional force outmaneuver a larger, slower enemy. The fleet was the real logistical achievement. 500 transport ships, 92 warships, and 30,000 sailors and rowers. Getting that many vessels provisioned and ready to sail was a triumph of Byzantine bureaucracy, the kind of organizational feat that Byzantium could pull off when it actually focused on something. Belisarius brought his wife, Antonina, with him. This was unusual but not unprecedented. Byzantine generals sometimes brought their families on campaign, and Antonina was no passive observer. She was intelligent, politically connected, and Theodora's closest friend. Having her along meant Belisarius had a direct line of communication to the empress, which was useful when dealing with an emperor as paranoid as Justinian. The fleet sailed in late June, hugging the coast of Greece before striking out across the open Mediterranean toward Sicily. The crossing was tense. Vandal ships could have intercepted them at any point. A storm could have scattered the fleet. Supplies could have run out. Any of a dozen disasters could have ended the campaign before it began. None of them happened. The fleet reached Sicily without incident, resupplied at Syracuse, still nominally Byzantine territory, and then made the final crossing to Africa. They landed at Caput Vada, a small port about 100 miles south of Carthage, in early September. The landing was unopposed. The Vandals knew the Byzantines were coming. It's hard to hide 500 ships, but they hadn't positioned forces at the landing site. This was either incompetence or strategy, and Belisarius couldn't tell which. Either way, it gave him time to establish a beachhead and organize his forces before the real fighting started. The first reports from the local population were encouraging. The Vandals were unpopular. A century of occupation had created resentment among the native Romano-African population, who still remembered being part of the empire. The Vandals were Arian Christians, considered heretics by the Orthodox population. They taxed heavily, confiscated land, and generally behaved like occupiers rather than legitimate rulers. This mattered. Belisarius wasn't just invading hostile territory, he was, in theory, liberating Roman citizens from barbarian rule. If the local population supported him, or at least didn't actively resist, the campaign would be much easier. But there was a complication. The Vandal king, Gelimer, wasn't in Carthage. He was inland, dealing with a rebellion in Sardinia. His absence was either incredible luck or a trap. Belisarius had to move before Gelimer returned with his full army, but he also had to be careful not to overextend. If he rushed toward Carthage and the Vandals caught him in the open, his small force would be destroyed. Belisarius made his decision quickly. Speed. They would march directly for Carthage, staying close to the coast so the fleet could provide supplies and support. The goal was to take the capital before Gelimer could organize a defense. If they succeeded, the psychological impact would be enormous. If they failed, they'd be trapped between the Vandal army and the sea. The march north was surreal. The roads were still Roman, maintained after a fashion, and the countryside looked almost peaceful. Olive groves, farms, villages. The locals watched the Byzantine army pass with a mixture of hope and fear. Some brought food, others just hid. No one was quite sure what to make of an imperial army marching through North Africa after a century of absence. Belisarius kept his troops on a tight leash. No looting, no unauthorized foraging, no harassing the locals. This wasn't cruelty, it was strategy. He needed the Romano-African population to see the Byzantines as liberators, not as another group of armed men taking what they wanted. Every act of discipline reinforced that message. The army covered the distance in about 2 weeks, which was impressively fast for an ancient army, with supply trains and cavalry. As they approached Carthage, scouts reported that Gelimer had returned from Sardinia and was moving to intercept them. The Vandal king had maybe 25,000 men, larger than the Byzantine force, and he knew the terrain. He also had the advantage of being on the defensive. Gelimer didn't need to destroy Belisarius. He just needed to hold him off long enough for supplies to run out, or morale to crack. The two armies met at a place called Ad Deximum, about 10 miles south of Carthage. It was early September, hot and dusty, and neither side was particularly eager for a pitched battle. But sometimes circumstances force decisions. Gelimer positioned his forces on the road to Carthage, blocking the Byzantine advance. His plan was simple: use his numerical superiority to overwhelm the Byzantine center, then encircle and destroy them. It was the kind of straightforward strategy that worked when you had more soldiers. Belisarius, as usual, had a different approach. He studied the terrain, noted that the road ran through a narrow valley with hills on either side, and realized that Gelimer's numbers were actually a disadvantage. A large army in a confined space couldn't maneuver effectively. Units would get in each other's way. Communication would break down. So Belisarius did what he'd done at Dara. He turned the enemy's strength into a weakness. He split his cavalry into 3 groups. One would engage the Vandal center, drawing them forward into the valley. The other 2 would move through the hills on either side, using the terrain to mask their movements, and then hit the Vandal flanks once they were committed to the center fight. It was risky. If the timing was off, if one of the flanking groups was discovered too early, the whole plan would collapse. But the alternative was a straightforward battle of attrition, and Belisarius knew he'd lose that. So he gambled on tactics, speed, and the Vandals not expecting anything clever. The battle started in the early afternoon. The Byzantine center engaged the Vandals, and Gelimer took the bait. He pushed his forces forward, trying to use his numerical advantage to crush the Byzantine line. His soldiers were confident. They outnumbered the enemy. They were defending their own territory. This should have been a straightforward victory. Then the Byzantine cavalry hit from the sides. The Vandals weren't prepared for it. Their formation was committed to pushing forward, and suddenly they were taking attacks from directions they hadn't anticipated. Units tried to turn to face the new threat, but that meant exposing their flanks to the Byzantine center. Communication broke down. Officers shouted contradictory orders. The neat Vandal formation dissolved into chaos. Gelimer saw what was happening and tried to pull his forces back, but retreat under pressure is one of the hardest military maneuvers to execute. Units at the front couldn't disengage because the Byzantine center was pressing them. Units at the rear didn't know they were supposed to retreat. The whole Vandal army started to fragment, and then Gelimer's brother, Amatus, who was commanding part of the Vandal force, was killed in the fighting. His death broke something. Morale collapsed. Soldiers who'd been confident an hour earlier now just wanted to survive. The retreat turned into a rout. Belisarius didn't pursue aggressively. He'd learned from experience that chasing a broken army could lead into ambushes or exhaust your own forces. Instead, he let the Vandals run and regrouped his army for the final push to Carthage. The city gates opened without resistance. The garrison had fled. The population, hearing that the Vandals had been defeated, welcomed the Byzantines as liberators. By sunset, Belisarius was in Carthage, and the Vandal kingdom was in ruins. It had taken less than 3 months. One battle, one brilliant tactical maneuver, and a century of Vandal rule was over. Justinian, receiving the news in Constantinople, must have been ecstatic. The restoration had begun. Rome was coming back. And it had all been accomplished by one general, who made the impossible look routine. But the campaign wasn't over yet. Gelimer had escaped with remnants of his army, and a wounded enemy could still be dangerous. The question was whether Belisarius could finish what he'd started before the situation got complicated. Carthage in September of 533 was a strange place. The Byzantine army had just walked into one of the great cities of the ancient world without a fight. The streets were intact. The harbor was functional. The warehouses were still full of grain. It was as if the Vandals had simply decided to leave the keys on the table and walk away. Belisarius knew better. Gelimer hadn't surrendered. He'd retreated, and there was a difference. The Vandal king still had an army, smaller now, demoralized but not destroyed. He'd pulled back to Numidia, the interior region west of Carthage, where he could regroup and potentially gather reinforcements from allied tribes. As long as Gelimer was alive and had soldiers willing to follow him, the war wasn't over. The citizens of Carthage weren't sure what to make of their new rulers. For a century they'd lived under Vandal occupation. Now the Byzantines had arrived, claiming to be liberators, promising a return to Roman order. Some people believed it. Others were more skeptical. They'd seen conquerors before, and conquerors always made promises. Belisarius understood this. He needed the local population on his side, or at least neutral. So he made a point of maintaining strict discipline among his troops. No looting, no violence against civilians. Soldiers caught stealing were flogged publicly. Officers who couldn't control their men were demoted. The message was clear. This wasn't an occupation. This was a restoration. It helped that Belisarius had an eye for symbolism. One of his first acts in Carthage was to attend services at the city's main church and publicly thank God for the victory. It was theater, but effective theater. The Orthodox Christian population saw a Byzantine general honoring their faith, reinforcing the idea that Byzantium represented legitimate authority rather than just another barbarian kingdom. But while Belisarius was managing politics in Carthage, Gelimer was rebuilding his army in Numidia. The Vandal king had retreated to Bulla Regia, a fortified town about 100 miles west of Carthage. He'd sent messengers to his brother Tsazo, who commanded Vandal forces in Sardinia, ordering him to return with reinforcements. He'd also reached out to Moorish tribes in the interior, offering gold and promises in exchange for military support. Gelimer's plan was straightforward. Wait for reinforcements, build up his strength, and then march on Carthage before the Byzantines could consolidate their hold on the region. If he moved fast enough, he might catch Belisarius overextended, with supply lines stretched across hostile territory. A single decisive victory could reverse everything. Belisarius knew this. He had scouts tracking Vandal movements, and the reports were concerning. Tsazo had left Sardinia with several thousand men and was sailing toward Africa. Moorish tribes were gathering. Gelimer's force was growing. If Belisarius waited too long, he'd face an enemy that might actually outnumber him significantly. So, he didn't wait. In early December, about 3 months after taking Carthage, Belisarius marched west with his entire available force. It was a calculated risk. He was leaving Carthage garrisoned with minimal troops, betting that he could defeat Gelimer before the Vandals could mount a counterattack on the capital. If he was wrong, he'd lose both the battle and the city. The two armies met at Tricamarum, about 20 miles west of Carthage, on a cold December day. Gelimer had positioned his forces on elevated ground near a stream, with the Vandal cavalry in the center and infantry on the flanks. Tsazo had arrived from Sardinia, bringing Gelimer's total force to maybe 25,000 men. The Byzantines had about 15,000, roughly the same numbers they'd had at Ad Decimum. This time, Gelimer was ready. He'd learned from the previous battle. His formations were more flexible, his flanks were protected, and he'd positioned reserves to respond to Byzantine cavalry maneuvers. On paper, it was a solid defensive setup. The Vandals had the high ground, numerical superiority and motivation. This was their last chance to save the kingdom. Belisarius surveyed the Vandal position. and made a decision that seemed reckless. He ordered a direct cavalry charge at the Vandal center. This wasn't his usual approach. At Dara, he'd used defensive positions and flanking maneuvers. At Ad Decimum, he'd relied on terrain and surprise. Now he was just charging? His officers must have been confused. The Vandals certainly were. They'd expected something clever, some tactical trick. Instead, they got a straightforward cavalry assault. The Byzantine heavy cavalry hit the Vandal center like a hammer. Not a wild, disorganized charge, but a controlled, professional assault. The horses were armored, the riders were experienced, and they struck with the kind of coordinated violence that only comes from years of training and discipline. The Vandal center buckled. This wasn't supposed to happen. They had good positions. They had numerical superiority, but the Byzantine cavalry was simply better. Better trained, better equipped, better led. The shock of the initial impact broke the Vandal formation, and once a cavalry formation breaks, it's almost impossible to reform under pressure. Zazo, commanding the Vandal center, tried to hold the line. He rode forward, rallying his men, organizing a counterattack. For a moment, it looked like he might stabilize the situation. Then a Byzantine cavalryman put a lance through his chest, and he died in the saddle. His death shattered Vandal morale. Zazo was Gelimer's brother, the second-ranking leader of the kingdom, and the man who'd sailed from Sardinia to save the campaign. Seeing him killed in plain view was devastating. The Vandal center collapsed entirely. Gelimer tried to save the battle by committing his reserves, but it was too late. The Byzantine cavalry had broken through the center and was now attacking the Vandal flanks from the rear. The Vandal infantry, seeing their cavalry defeated and their commanders dead, began to retreat. The retreat became a rout. Belisarius pursued this time, but carefully. He'd learned at Ad Decimum not to chase too aggressively, but he also knew that a broken army needed to be kept broken. His cavalry harried the Vandal retreat, cutting down stragglers, preventing any attempt to regroup. The pursuit went on for miles. By nightfall, the Vandal army had ceased to exist as a fighting force. Thousands were dead. Thousands more had scattered into the countryside. Gelimer escaped with a small bodyguard, but he was now a king without an army, a ruler without a kingdom. The Vandal state, which had dominated North Africa for nearly a century, had been destroyed in 2 battles over the course of 3 months. It was one of the most decisive military campaigns in Byzantine history. 2 major victories, minimal casualties, and the complete conquest of a kingdom. Belisarius had done in 1 season what the previous Byzantine expedition had failed to do in years. The aftermath was almost anticlimactic. Gelimer fled to Mount Papua in Numidia, where he held out for a few months before finally surrendering in March of 534. He was treated well, Belisarius wasn't cruel, and eventually transported to Constantinople, where Justinian gave him lands and a pension. The former Vandal king spent the rest of his life as a gentleman farmer in Anatolia, which was probably better than he'd expected. The Vandal nobility was absorbed into the Byzantine system. Some were given positions in the imperial administration. Others were enrolled in the army and sent to fight Persia, which must have been deeply ironic for people who'd spent their lives fighting against Rome. The Vandal kingdom ceased to exist, not with a dramatic final battle, but with a quiet integration into the empire. North Africa was Roman again. The grain ships resumed sailing to Constantinople. The Orthodox Church re-established its authority over the African dioceses. Roads were repaired, fortifications rebuilt, tax systems reinstated. Within a year, it was as if the Vandals had never existed. Justinian was ecstatic. His grand vision of restoration was working. The old empire was coming back piece by piece, and all it had taken was one brilliant general and a relatively small army. The reconquest of Africa proved that it could be done. The Western territories could be reclaimed. Rome could be Rome again. In Constantinople, Belisarius was celebrated with a triumph, a formal procession through the city where he displayed captured Vandal treasure, prisoners, and standards. It was the first triumph the empire had celebrated in centuries, a conscious echo of ancient Roman glory. Belisarius walked through the streets while crowds cheered, carrying the spoils of war to lay at Justinian's feet. And then, in a move that was either incredibly smart or incredibly naive, Belisarius refused any personal rewards. No estates, no titles beyond what he already had, no political positions. He just asked to return to military service, give him another campaign, point him at another enemy. He'd do the work. Justinian must have found this both reassuring and unsettling. Reassuring because it confirmed Belisarius's loyalty. A general who didn't want political power was a general who wouldn't stage a coup. Unsettling because it was almost inhuman. Who won campaigns like this and didn't want something in return? But there wasn't time to dwell on it, because while North Africa had been easy, the next target was much harder. Italy, the home of Rome itself, the heart of the old empire. And it was held by the Ostrogoths, who were much more formidable than the Vandals had ever been. Justinian ordered the invasion. Belisarius, as always, obeyed. In 535, barely a year after conquering Africa, he was loading his army onto ships again. This time, the destination was Sicily, the stepping stone to Italy. The objective was nothing less than Rome. The campaign would take nearly 20 years. It would involve sieges, betrayals, desperate last stands, and tactical brilliance that made the African campaign look simple. It would drain the Byzantine treasury, exhaust the army, and transform Belisarius from a celebrated hero into a political liability. But none of that was visible yet. In 535, fresh from victory, sailing towards Sicily with the wind at his back, Belisarius must have felt like anything was possible. He'd reconquered North Africa in 3 months. How hard could Italy be? He was about to find out. Understanding how Belisarius won battles requires understanding the army he built. It wasn't the legions of ancient Rome, those were centuries gone. It wasn't the medieval feudal forces that would come later. It was something in between, something uniquely Byzantine, and something that only worked because Belisarius understood how to make very different people fight together. The typical Byzantine army of the 6th century was a mess. Units spoke different languages. Soldiers came from different cultures with different fighting traditions. Equipment was inconsistent. Pay was irregular. Loyalty was to individual commanders rather than the state. Most generals treated their armies like temporary collections of armed men who would scatter as soon as the campaign ended. Belisarius treated his army like a permanent institution. He built systems, established routines, and created a military culture that transcended the usual ethnic and tribal divisions. His soldiers didn't just fight for him, they believed in the way he ran things, and that belief made them far more effective than they should have been. Start with the composition. A typical Belisarius campaign force had maybe 15 to 20,000 men, divided roughly into infantry and cavalry. The infantry was mostly Byzantine, Romans from Anatolia, Thrace, and the Balkans, professional soldiers who'd trained in formation fighting and knew how to hold a line. They weren't the legendary legionaries of old Rome, but they were competent, disciplined, and reliable. The cavalry was more complicated. Some were Byzantine heavy cavalry, cataphracts, armored horsemen who could match Persian or Gothic cavalry in direct combat. But Belisarius also employed light cavalry from the steppes, Huns, Herulians, Massagetae. These were tribal warriors who fought as mounted archers, hitting fast and retreating before the enemy could respond. They despised the heavy cavalry, who they thought were slow and clumsy. The heavy cavalry despised them back, considering them undisciplined barbarians. Getting these groups to cooperate should have been impossible. In most Byzantine armies, it was impossible. Units would refuse to support each other. Cavalry would abandon infantry in critical moments. Ethnic tensions would explode into violence in camp. Belisarius somehow made it work. The key was discipline, but not the brutal, mindless discipline of punishment and fear. It was the discipline of professionalism. Belisarius established clear rules and enforced them consistently. Looting civilians was forbidden, with severe penalties. Disputes between soldiers were settled through formal arbitration rather than brawls. Officers who couldn't control their men were removed. Pay was distributed fairly and on time, which sounds obvious, but was revolutionary in Byzantine military culture. More importantly, Belisarius made sure his soldiers understood why they were doing things. Before battles, he'd explain the tactical plan to his officers, who'd relay it to their troops. This wasn't standard practice. Most generals just issued orders and expected obedience. Belisarius wanted his men to understand the logic. A soldier who knows why he's being positioned on a particular hill will hold that position better than one who's just following blind orders. Training was constant. Even during campaigns when the army wasn't actively fighting, Belisarius insisted on drills. Formations had to be practiced until they became automatic. Cavalry units had to coordinate with infantry. Archers had to maintain their rate of fire under pressure. It was tedious, repetitive work, and most soldiers hated it. But when the actual fighting started, they understood why it mattered. The logistics were just as important as the fighting. Belisarius knew that an army without supplies was just a mob waiting to disintegrate. He established supply lines meticulously, using the Byzantine administrative system to organize food, equipment, and reinforcements. When the army moved, supply wagons moved with it. When the army stopped, supply depots were established. Soldiers weren't expected to forage from the countryside, which kept local populations friendly and prevented the kind of undisciplined chaos that destroyed most armies. Medical care was surprisingly sophisticated. Byzantine armies had field surgeons who could treat wounds, set broken bones, and sometimes even perform basic surgery. Belisarius made sure his medical staff was well supplied with bandages, herbs, and wine for disinfection. Wounded soldiers who could be saved were saved, which did wonders for morale. Knowing that your commander wouldn't abandon you if you got injured made soldiers much more willing to take risks in combat. Camp life followed a strict routine. The army would fortify every camp, even if they were only staying one night. Ditches were dug, ramparts raised, watch posts established. It was exhausting work after a day's march, but it meant the army could defend itself against surprise attacks. The camp layout was standardized. Everyone knew where their unit was supposed to be, where the supply wagons went, where the command tent stood. This consistency meant the army could set up and break camp quickly and efficiently. Meals were communal and organized. Soldiers were divided into units of 10 called contubernium, a Latin term borrowed from the old legions. Each unit shared a tent, cooked together, and was responsible for maintaining their own equipment. This created small group cohesion. Soldiers weren't just fighting for the empire or for Belisarius. They were fighting for the 9 other men who shared their tent and their meals. The food itself was basic but adequate. Hardtack, dried meat, cheese, olives, wine diluted with water. When possible, the army would acquire fresh bread, vegetables, and occasionally meat. Soldiers were expected to maintain their own rations between supply deliveries, which meant they had to be responsible and plan ahead. This wasn't as glamorous as heroic battlefield exploits, but it kept the army functional. Religious observance was regular and important. The Byzantine army was Christian, and Belisarius made sure there were priests accompanying the force. Services were held before battles, and soldiers were encouraged, though not forced, to attend. This served multiple purposes. It reinforced morale, created a sense of shared purpose, and reminded everyone that they were fighting for Christendom against heretics and pagans. The religious dimension wasn't just propaganda. Many soldiers genuinely believed they were on a holy mission. But Belisarius also employed non-Christian soldiers, Huns, Herulians, and other pagan tribes from the steppes. He didn't try to convert them or suppress their beliefs. As long as they followed orders and maintained discipline, their religion was their own business. This pragmatism was unusual in an era when religious conformity was often enforced brutally. It also made Belisarius's army more diverse and capable than most Byzantine forces. The relationship between officers and soldiers was carefully managed. Byzantine military culture had a tradition of officers being aristocrats who looked down on common soldiers. Belisarius came from relatively humble origins himself, and he made a point of being accessible. He'd walk through the camp, talk to soldiers, listen to complaints. Not in a democratic way, this wasn't a debate club, but in a way that made soldiers feel heard. He was also willing to share hardships. When supplies ran short, Belisarius ate the same rations as his soldiers. When the army marched through difficult terrain, he marched with them rather than riding comfortably in the rear. These gestures mattered. Soldiers would tolerate incredible hardship if they believed their commander was enduring it alongside them. Punishment, when necessary, was public and swift. Soldiers who broke the rules were flogged or executed in front of the assembled army. This sounds brutal, and it was, but it also reinforced the idea that rules applied to everyone. More importantly, Belisarius never punished arbitrarily. If you followed the rules, you were safe. If you broke them, you faced consequences. That predictability created a sense of security that made soldiers more willing to trust the system. Rewards were also public. After battles, Belisarius would distribute captured treasure to his troops according to rank and contribution. This wasn't just about money, it was about recognition. Soldiers who'd fought well were acknowledged in front of their peers. Units that had performed exceptionally were praised. This created a competitive culture where soldiers wanted to excel not just for personal gain, but for the respect of their comrades. The army moved with surprising speed. A typical day's march was 15 to 20 miles, which doesn't sound like much until you factor in armor, weapons, supply wagons, and rough terrain. Belisarius could push his army faster when necessary, sometimes covering 30 miles in a day, but he was careful not to exhaust his troops. A tired army made mistakes, and mistakes got people killed. Communication was handled through a system of horns, flags, and messengers. Orders could be transmitted across the battlefield quickly and clearly, which gave Belisarius a decisive advantage over enemies whose communication systems were slower and less organized. His officers knew the signals, and soldiers were trained to respond immediately. This kind of coordination was rare in ancient warfare, where battles often devolved into chaotic melees, where commanders lost control. The army also had engineers, specialists who understood siege warfare, bridge construction, and fortification. When Belisarius needed to cross a river, his engineers would build pontoon bridges. When he needed to besiege a city, they'd construct siege engines. This technical expertise gave the Byzantine army capabilities that most barbarian forces lacked. The Vandals and Goths had brave warriors, but they didn't have professional engineers. Intelligence gathering was constant. Belisarius used scouts extensively, sending cavalry patrols ahead to map terrain, locate enemy forces, and identify potential ambush sites. He also cultivated local informants, paying civilians for information about enemy movements. This intelligence network meant he rarely walked into surprises. Most of his tactical victories came from knowing more about the enemy than they knew about him. What made all this work was consistency. Belisarius didn't invent these systems on the spot. He built them over years, refined them through experience, and maintained them even when it would have been easier to cut corners. Other generals would skip the fortifications when setting up camp, or let discipline slide when supplies were good, or ignore training during peacetime. Belisarius never did. The standards remained the same whether the army was winning or losing, whether supplies were abundant or scarce. The result was an army that functioned like a well-maintained machine. Not perfect, no army is perfect, but reliable, adaptable, and far more effective than its size suggested. When Belisarius won battles against numerically superior enemies, it wasn't magic. It was the cumulative effect of 1,000 small organizational decisions that made his soldiers better trained, better supplied, and better led than their opponents. And the soldiers knew it. They grumbled about the drills and the discipline and the strict rules because soldiers always grumble. But they also knew that when the fighting started, their general would have a plan. The plan would make sense, and they'd have a real chance of surviving. In an era when most armies were led by incompetent aristocrats who got their men killed for no reason, that kind of leadership was worth following. Which is why, when Belisarius marched toward Italy to face the Ostrogoths, his army followed without hesitation. They'd been to Persia. They'd conquered North Africa. Now they were going to retake Rome itself, and they believed they could actually do it. Justinian had a problem, and the problem was success. Belisarius kept winning. He'd defeated the Persians at Dara, saved Constantinople during the Nika riots, conquered North Africa in 3 months, and was now preparing to invade Italy. Every victory proved that the general was brilliant, loyal, and indispensable, and every victory made the emperor more nervous. This wasn't paranoia, this was Roman history. The pattern had repeated itself for centuries. A general wins battles. The army loves him. He marches on the capital. The emperor dies. The general becomes the new emperor. It had happened with Caesar, with Constantine, with dozens of others. The path from military hero to political threat was well worn and predictable. Belisarius showed no signs of ambition. He refused honors. He declined estates. He asked for nothing beyond permission to keep serving. But that, from Justinian's perspective, was almost more suspicious. Who wins campaigns like these and doesn't want something in return? Either Belisarius was genuinely without ambition, which seemed inhuman, or he was playing a longer game, building loyalty among the troops and waiting for the right moment to strike. Justinian couldn't decide which interpretation was correct, so he did what Byzantine emperors always did when faced with uncertainty. He hedged. He gave Belisarius resources to continue the campaigns because the reconquest needed to succeed. But he also made sure the general never had quite enough resources to become truly independent. Always just a little short of men, always slightly underfunded, always dependent on imperial support to continue. The system worked through deliberate inefficiency. Belisarius would request 20,000 troops. Justinian would send 15,000. The general would ask for supplies for 6 months. The emperor would provide 4 months' worth. Not so little that the campaign would fail. Justinian needed victories, but just enough to keep Belisarius reliant on Constantinople. A general who needed constant resupply from the capital couldn't rebel against that capital. The emperor also sent watchers. They weren't called spies officially. They were imperial commissioners, accountants, administrators, men whose job was supposedly to handle logistics and finances. But everyone knew their real purpose: report back to Constantinople about what Belisarius was doing, saying, and planning. Every decision was observed. Every conversation was potentially recorded. Every success was analyzed, not just for military merit, but for political implications. Antonina, Belisarius's wife, understood the game better than her husband did. She'd grown up in Constantinople, daughter of a charioteer, and she'd learned how palace politics worked long before she married a soldier. She maintained close ties with Empress Theodora, writing letters that kept the imperial couple informed and reassured. It was a delicate balance, showing enough loyalty to prevent suspicion while not appearing to be spying on her own husband. But the tensions grew as the victories accumulated. After North Africa fell, Justinian held a triumph in Constantinople, and Belisarius was the star. He walked through the streets with captured Vandal treasure, prisoners in chains, and standards taken from Gelimer's army. The crowd went wild. They loved him. This was the general who was bringing Rome back, making the empire great again, proving that Byzantium could still win. Justinian watched from the imperial box and saw a political problem. The crowd wasn't cheering for the emperor. They were cheering for the general. And in Constantinople, popularity was power. The emperor ruled because people accepted his authority. If someone else became more popular, more respected, more loved, what stopped that person from taking the throne? So Justinian began implementing checks. He appointed other generals to secondary commands in Belisarius's campaigns, men whose loyalty was to the emperor first. He created bureaucratic oversight structures that required Belisarius to report every major decision. He made sure that any territorial gains were administered by civilians appointed from Constantinople, not by military officers loyal to Belisarius. The general noticed these restrictions, of course. He wasn't naive, but his response was always the same. He kept working. If the emperor sent fewer troops, he'd win with fewer troops. If supplies were short, he'd make do. If commissioners needed reports, he'd write reports. Belisarius seemed to operate on the principle that excellence would speak for itself, that if he just kept delivering victories, the political complications would resolve themselves. This drove Justinian crazy, because how do you control someone who won't play the game? Byzantine politics ran on ambition, greed, and fear. Everyone wanted something: land, titles, money, power. You controlled people by giving them what they wanted, or threatening to take it away. But Belisarius didn't want anything except to serve. He was like trying to grab water with your fists. The emperor's distrust manifested in increasingly petty ways. After the African campaign, Justinian ordered that all captured Vandal treasure be sent to Constantinople rather than distributed to the troops. This was technically legal. All war spoils belonged to the state, but it was also terrible for morale. Soldiers fought harder when they knew there was potential reward. Belisarius protested, pointing out that denying the troops their share would make future campaigns more difficult. Justinian ignored him and kept the treasure. Then there was the matter of reinforcements. Belisarius would request specific units, experienced soldiers who'd fought with him before and knew his tactical methods. Justinian would send different units instead, often green troops with no combat experience. The official reason was that the requested units were needed elsewhere. The real reason was that Justinian didn't want Belisarius building up a corps of veteran soldiers who were personally loyal to him. The Italian campaign, which began in 535, would test this dysfunctional relationship to its limits. Italy was much larger than North Africa, more heavily defended, and home to the Ostrogoths, who were far more formidable than the Vandals. The campaign would require sustained effort over years, not months, and it would require trust between the emperor and his general. They didn't have that trust. Justinian needed Belisarius to succeed, but feared what success would mean. Belisarius needed resources from Justinian, but had to operate under constant suspicion. It was a partnership built on mutual necessity rather than mutual confidence. The general tried to maintain perspective. He'd grown up in Thrace, where survival meant doing your job regardless of politics. The empire needed defending. Territories needed reconquering. If the emperor was suspicious, that was the emperor's problem. Belisarius would focus on what he could control: tactics, logistics, training, battles. But the political pressure was wearing. Every decision was scrutinized. Every victory was analyzed for hidden motives. When Belisarius won battles, the commissioners would investigate whether he'd shown too much mercy to defeated enemies. Were they potential allies for a future rebellion? When he distributed captured supplies to his troops, accountants would examine the records looking for evidence of embezzlement or building unauthorized loyalty. The most frustrating part was that Belisarius understood why Justinian was paranoid. Roman history justified it. Generals did rebel. Armies did march on capitals. The emperor's caution wasn't irrational, but it was still exhausting to fight two wars simultaneously, one against the empire's actual enemies, another against your own government's suspicion. Antonina tried to mediate. She wrote to Theodora, emphasizing Belisarius's loyalty. She organized social occasions where the general could interact with imperial officials in non-military contexts, trying to humanize him, to make people see him as something other than a potential threat. Sometimes it worked. Other times it made things worse because watching Belisarius at social events just reinforced how uncomfortable he was with politics, which made him seem either admirably straightforward or suspiciously simple, depending on your perspective. The Gothic campaign would bring all these tensions to a crisis point. There would be moments when Belisarius, besieged in Rome with minimal supplies and no reinforcements, would wonder if Justinian was deliberately letting him fail. There would be moments when Justinian, hearing reports of Belisarius's victories in Italy, would wonder if the general was building an independent power base, but that was still ahead. In 535, as the army loaded onto ships bound for Sicily, Belisarius was focused on the immediate task. The Ostrogoths controlled Italy. Italy needed to be reconquered. The logistics would be challenging, the fighting would be brutal, and the campaign would probably take years. But he'd done the impossible before. What he didn't fully appreciate yet was that the real enemy wasn't always across the battlefield. Sometimes it was in the palace, writing letters, examining reports, and wondering whether the empire's greatest general was also its greatest threat. Justinian never resolved this question. For the rest of their lives, the emperor would need Belisarius and fear him in equal measure. He'd send the general on campaigns while simultaneously restricting his resources. He'd celebrate his victories while investigating him for treason. He'd proclaim him the empire's greatest hero while making sure he never had enough power to be dangerous. And Belisarius would keep serving, not because he was naive, not because he didn't notice the restrictions and the suspicion, but because, in his view, the empire was larger than any individual's dignity. If Justinian's paranoia was the price of keeping the reconquest moving forward, then he'd pay that price. It was a tragic dynamic. Two men who needed each other, respected each other's abilities, and could have accomplished so much more if they trusted each other. Instead, they were locked in a relationship where success bred suspicion, where loyalty looked like ambition, and where the empire's greatest general had to fight with one hand while the other was tied behind his back by his own emperor. The pattern would repeat for 20 years. Belisarius would win battles. Justinian would worry. The general would be recalled, investigated, redeployed. He'd save the empire repeatedly, and each time the emperor would wonder if he'd just made his eventual usurper stronger. In the end, Justinian's suspicion would nearly destroy Belisarius. But not yet. First, there was Rome to conquer, and even a suspicious emperor needed his general for that. Rome in December of 536 was waiting. The city that had ruled the world for 1,000 years now belonged to the Ostrogoths, and everyone knew the Byzantines were coming. Belisarius had taken Sicily without a fight, landed in southern Italy, and was marching north. The question wasn't whether he'd reach Rome. The question was, what would happen when he did? The Ostrogoths weren't like the Vandals. They'd held Italy for 60 years, and they'd done it well. Their king, Theodoric, had been one of the most effective rulers in post-Roman history, maintaining roads, preserving Roman institutions, keeping the peace between Goths and Italians. When he died in 526, the kingdom had been stable, prosperous, and legitimate. By 536, things were more complicated. The current Gothic king was Vitiges, a military commander who'd been elevated to the throne during a political crisis. He was competent, experienced, and faced with an impossible situation. The Byzantines were coming with the explicit goal of reconquering Italy. The Italian population was mostly Roman, Orthodox Christian, and potentially sympathetic to Byzantine rule. The Gothic army was strong, but it was also spread across the entire Italian peninsula, trying to defend multiple fronts. Vitiges made a strategic decision: withdraw to Ravenna in the north and concentrate his forces. This meant abandoning Rome to the Byzantines, which seemed like surrender but was actually pragmatic. Rome was enormous, difficult to defend, and required a huge garrison. Better to let Belisarius take the city than besiege him there with the full Gothic army once it had assembled. It was a good plan. It almost worked. Belisarius entered Rome on December 9th, 536. The Gothic garrison had already left. The city gates opened without resistance. The population, uncertain about what Byzantine rule would mean, watched nervously as the army marched through streets that hadn't seen an imperial army in decades. Rome was still magnificent, even after years of decline. The walls were 40 feet high in places, built by Emperor Aurelian 3 centuries earlier. The aqueduct still functioned, bringing water from miles away. The forums and temples were intact, though many had been converted to churches. This was the city that had conquered the Mediterranean, and even in diminished form, it was awe-inspiring. Belisarius had about 5,000 men, maybe 7,000 if you counted all the non-combat personnel. Rome had a circumference of 12 miles. Defending 12 miles of wall with 5,000 soldiers was mathematical insanity. Most commanders wouldn't have even tried. But Belisarius didn't plan to just defend. He planned to survive until reinforcements arrived, which Justinian had promised would come in the spring. 6 months. He needed to hold Rome for 6 months against a Gothic army that was gathering in the north and would outnumber him possibly 10 to 1. He started preparing immediately. The walls needed repair. Sections had crumbled over decades of neglect. Belisarius put civilians to work fixing breaches, reinforcing gates, clearing debris. He organized the garrison into rotation shifts so that every section of wall was constantly manned, even though this meant soldiers got minimal rest. He stockpiled food in central locations, anticipating siege conditions. The Tiber River ran through Rome, which was both an advantage and a problem. It provided water, which was crucial, but it also meant the walls had gaps where the river entered and exited the city. Belisarius had chains stretched across these openings and positioned boats with archers to defend them. It was improvised, but it worked. The civilian population was terrified. They'd welcomed the Byzantines cautiously, hoping for stability and lower taxes. Now they were trapped in a city about to be besieged by an army that would blame them for admitting the enemy. Belisarius addressed this by being straightforward. Stay calm, follow instructions, don't hoard food, and report anyone trying to collaborate with the Goths. He also made sure his soldiers didn't loot or abuse civilians, which helped maintain order. In February of 537, the Gothic army arrived. Vitiges had spent 2 months assembling forces from across Italy, maybe 100,000 men, though ancient numbers are always unreliable. Even conservative estimates put the Gothic force at 20 to 30,000, which was still overwhelming. They set up camps around the entire circumference of Rome, completely encircling the city. The first Gothic assault came within days. They attacked the Salarian Gate on the north side with siege towers, battering rams and thousands of infantry. The assault was straightforward, brutal, and exactly what Belisarius expected. He'd reinforced the gate beforehand, positioned archers on the walls, and set up defensive firing positions. The Gothic siege towers approached through a hail of arrows. Some caught fire from Byzantine fire arrows, not the mythical Greek fire, which was a later invention, but simple burning pitch. Others reached the walls and deployed ramps, allowing Gothic soldiers to storm onto the ramparts. This was where the fighting became desperate. Hand-to-hand combat on narrow walls, soldiers pushing each other off, ladders being shoved away, boiling oil poured from above. The Byzantines held, barely. The Gothic assault broke after several hours, leaving hundreds of bodies around the gate. But Vitiges had made his point. He had enough men to attack continuously, to probe every section of wall, to exhaust the defenders through sheer persistence. Belisarius realized the pattern immediately. The Goths would attack, get repulsed, rest, and attack again. They didn't need to break through. They just needed to keep up the pressure until the Byzantine garrison was too exhausted to resist. It was siege warfare as attrition, and the mathematics favored the attackers. So he changed the mathematics. Instead of purely defending, Belisarius started launching sorties. Small cavalry units would exit the city through gates the Goths weren't currently attacking, raid their camps, kill sentries, burn supplies, and retreat before the Gothic army could respond. These weren't decisive actions. They weren't destroying the Gothic force, but they were disruptive. The besiegers had to maintain constant vigilance, which meant they couldn't rest either. The most famous sortie happened in March. Belisarius personally led a cavalry charge against a Gothic camp, overran it, and retreated back to the city. The Goths pursued, which was exactly what he wanted. As they approached the walls, Byzantine archers opened fire from above, while the cavalry turned and charged again. The Goths were caught between the cavalry and the archery, and they took heavy casualties. Vitiges learned from this and adjusted his tactics. He pulled his camps further from the walls, out of archery range. He posted stronger guards. He became more cautious, which was smart, but also meant the siege settled into a grinding stalemate. Food became the critical issue. Belisarius had stockpiled supplies before the siege, but 5,000 soldiers and tens of thousands of civilians eat a lot. By April, rations were being reduced. By May, people were hungry. The Gothic strategy was working. Even if they couldn't break the walls, they could starve the city into surrender. Belisarius tried to maintain morale through visibility. He'd walk the walls, talk to soldiers, inspect defenses. He made sure that everyone saw him sharing the same reduced rations, sleeping in the same uncomfortable conditions. It was leadership by example, and it mattered. Soldiers who might have despaired under a distant commander kept fighting because their general was right there with them, but visibility couldn't replace food. The garrison was weakening. Disease started spreading in the cramped, unsanitary conditions. Some soldiers deserted, lowering themselves from the walls at night and fleeing to the countryside. The civilian population was on the edge of panic. Rumors spread that Belisarius was planning to abandon the city, that reinforcements would never come, that everyone was going to die. Then, in May, Gothic engineers cut the aqueducts. Rome had always depended on external water sources, and now those were gone. The Tiber provided some water, but not enough for the entire population. Belisarius implemented strict rationing. Wells were dug inside the city, though they didn't provide much. People started getting sick from drinking contaminated water. This was the crisis point. The garrison was hungry, thirsty, exhausted, and increasingly hopeless. The Gothic army was camped outside, patient and strong. Reinforcements from Constantinople had been promised for months and hadn't arrived. Every rational analysis said Rome would fall. Belisarius called his officers together. The meeting was tense. Some argued for surrender, negotiate terms while they still had bargaining power. Others wanted to attempt a mass breakout, abandoning the city but saving the army. A few suggested holding out longer, though no one could explain how that would actually work. Belisarius listened to all of them, then explained his position. They were staying. They were holding Rome. Not because the situation was good, it obviously wasn't, but because surrendering would mean losing Italy, losing the entire campaign, and making everything they'd accomplished worthless. If they held just a few more weeks, reinforcements might arrive. If they broke out or surrendered, the war was over. It was the kind of speech that works in movies, but rarely in real life. Except Belisarius had the credibility to make it work. He'd won at Dara when everyone thought he'd lose. He'd conquered North Africa when it seemed impossible. His officers believed him because he'd been right before. So they stayed. Through May, through June, through July. The garrison ate whatever could be found. Dogs, rats, leather. The civilian population suffered terribly. Disease killed more people than Gothic attacks. The walls were manned by soldiers who could barely stand. And then, in late July, scouts reported ships in the port at Ostia. Byzantine ships. Reinforcements had finally arrived. Not as many as promised, but something. 1,600 cavalry under a general named John. Not enough to break the siege, but enough to change the equation. Belisarius now had options, and the Goths were about to learn that the siege of Rome wasn't over. It was just entering a new phase. The arrival of 1,600 cavalry in late July of 537 should have been a footnote. Vitiges had tens of thousands of soldiers surrounding Rome. What difference could 1,600 men make? The answer, it turned out, was everything. Because those 1,600 men weren't reinforcing the garrison inside Rome, they were going to attack the Goths from outside. Belisarius's plan was audacious to the point of insanity. Instead of bringing the reinforcements into the city to strengthen the defense, he ordered General John to operate independently in Gothic territory, raid their supply lines, attack their camps, force Vitiges to divert troops away from Rome to deal with this new threat. It was a calculated gamble that the Gothic king would react predictably, and he did. John's cavalry struck fast and hard. They appeared at Gothic supply depots, burned them, and disappeared before resistance could organize. They ambushed messenger units, disrupting communications between Vitiges and his forces elsewhere in Italy. They raided the outskirts of Gothic camps around Rome, killing sentries and creating the impression of a much larger force operating in the area. The psychological impact was immediate. The Gothic soldiers besieging Rome had been comfortable. They outnumbered the defenders massively. They controlled the countryside. The siege was just a matter of time. Now, suddenly, they weren't safe. Their supplies were vulnerable. Their camps could be attacked. The besiegers were being besieged. Vitiges faced an impossible choice. If he ignored John's raiders, his supply lines would collapse and the siege would fail. If he diverted troops to chase them, he'd weaken the siege and give Belisarius an opening. He chose to split his forces, sending several thousand men north to protect supply routes and hunt down the Byzantine cavalry. That was the mistake Belisarius had been waiting for. The moment the Gothic army divided, the garrison in Rome went on the offensive. Belisarius launched the largest sortie of the entire siege. cavalry and infantry, pouring out of multiple gates simultaneously, hitting Gothic camps while they were disorganized and undermanned. The fighting was brutal. The Goths, caught by surprise, tried to mount a defense, but they'd been expecting a defensive siege, not aggressive attacks. Byzantine cavalry rode through their camps, setting fires and creating chaos. Infantry units engaged Gothic forces that were still trying to form up. It wasn't a set-piece battle with neat formations. It was violent, confused street fighting in a siege camp. The Byzantines withdrew before the Goths could properly counterattack, taking captured supplies and weapons back into the city. The sortie hadn't destroyed the Gothic army, but it had accomplished something more important. It proved that Rome wasn't a trapped garrison waiting to surrender. It was still dangerous, still capable of inflicting damage. Vitiges, receiving reports of the raid, realized his position was deteriorating. He'd been besieging Rome for 5 months. His army had taken continuous casualties. Supplies were becoming problematic. And now, instead of starving the Byzantines into submission, he was fighting a two-front war against both the garrison and John's raiders. In August, more Byzantine reinforcements arrived. Not a massive army, maybe 3,000 men, but enough to shift the balance. Belisarius now had sufficient forces to maintain the garrison and conduct offensive operations. The siege, which had seemed like a foregone conclusion in the spring, was now a stalemate. Worse, from the Gothic perspective, other Byzantine commanders were active elsewhere in Italy. Ravenna was being threatened. Gothic territories in the south were falling to smaller Byzantine forces. Vitiges was besieging Rome while his kingdom was being dismantled around him. By December of 537, after a full year of siege, Vitiges withdrew. He pulled his army back to Ravenna, leaving Rome in Byzantine hands. It wasn't a surrender. He still controlled most of northern Italy, but it was an admission that the siege had failed. Rome, which should have fallen in weeks, had held for a year. The victory was as much psychological as military. Belisarius had defended the Eternal City with a fraction of the forces anyone thought necessary. He'd turned a siege into a counter-offensive. He'd made the impossible look routine, again. But the Italian campaign was far from over. Vitiges still had an army. He still controlled key cities, and now he was angry. The Gothic king sent messengers to Constantinople, trying to negotiate. He offered to cede southern Italy to Byzantium if they'd let him keep the north. Justinian considered it. A negotiated peace would save money and lives. Belisarius, when asked for his opinion, gave a blunt assessment. Any peace that left the Goths in power would be temporary. They'd rebuild, rearm, and attack again within a generation. The only way to secure Italy permanently was complete conquest. Justinian, convinced by this logic and hungry for a total victory, ordered the campaign to continue. So Belisarius marched north. The Gothic War entered its second phase, and this would be even more difficult than the siege of Rome. Ravenna was heavily fortified. The Gothic army, though demoralized, was still large, and other complications were emerging. The most significant problem was political. As Belisarius advanced, Gothic nobles started approaching him with offers. They were willing to abandon Vitiges and make Belisarius king of Italy. The offers were serious. The Goths respected him more than they respected their own king. If he accepted, he'd rule the entire Italian peninsula, independently, without answering to Constantinople. It was the scenario Justinian had feared from the beginning. A successful general, loved by his troops, offered a crown by the people he'd conquered. Every precedent in Roman history said Belisarius should accept. Caesar had crossed the Rubicon for less. Belisarius refused, not quietly or ambiguously, but explicitly and publicly. He told the Gothic nobles that he served the emperor, that Italy belonged to Byzantium, and that their offers were treasonous. The Goths were baffled. Romans didn't turn down crowns. Ambition was supposed to be universal. What kind of man wins a kingdom and then gives it away? When news reached Constantinople, Justinian's reaction was complicated. Relief that Belisarius hadn't rebelled. Suspicion about why he hadn't. Was it genuine loyalty or a longer game? Gratitude mixed with paranoia. The emperor sent letters praising the general's loyalty, while simultaneously ordering closer surveillance. Just in case, the campaign ground on through 538 and 539. Byzantine forces took city after city. Milan fell, then was retaken by the Goths in a brutal siege where most of the population was slaughtered. The war was getting uglier. What had started as a reconquest was becoming a devastating conflict that destroyed the very territories it was supposed to liberate. Belisarius was exhausted. He'd been fighting continuously for years, Persia, Africa, Italy. The victories were real, but so was the cost. His army was worn down. Replacements from Constantinople were inadequate. Supplies were always short, and every decision was scrutinized by imperial commissioners looking for evidence of disloyalty. In 540, Ravenna finally fell. The Gothic capital surrendered after a long siege, and Vitiges was captured. The Gothic kingdom collapsed. Italy was Byzantine again, at least in theory. Belisarius had accomplished what seemed impossible. He'd reconquered the Italian peninsula with a consistently undermanned and undersupplied army. Justinian's response was to recall him immediately to Constantinople. The official reason was that the general was needed for the Persian frontier, where tensions were rising again. The actual reason was that Belisarius, having conquered Italy, was now too powerful and too popular. He needed to be removed from the Western territories before he became a political threat. Belisarius obeyed. He always obeyed. He left Italy in 540, bringing Vitiges as a prisoner, and returned to Constantinople. The campaign had lasted 5 years, cost thousands of lives, and nearly bankrupted the imperial treasury. But Rome was Roman again. The dream of restoration was real, except the dream was already cracking. The Goths would rebel again. The Byzantines didn't have enough troops to hold all of Italy. The territories Belisarius had conquered would need to be reconquered repeatedly, and the general who'd won everything would soon learn that victory in Byzantium was more dangerous than defeat. The pattern was set. Belisarius would be sent on impossible missions. He'd succeed through tactical brilliance and sheer determination. Justinian would reward him and suspect him in equal measure. The empire would benefit from his genius while treating him as a potential traitor, and Belisarius, caught in this trap, would keep serving. Because for him, the empire was larger than personal dignity, larger than fair treatment, larger than gratitude or recognition. He'd given his life to restoring Rome, and he'd continue giving it, even as the empire slowly destroyed him. But that destruction would be gradual, unfolding over years. For now, returning to Constantinople in 540, Belisarius was still the hero, still the general who'd done the impossible. The crowd still cheered. Justinian still needed him. How long that would last was anyone's guess. While Belisarius was fighting wars across the Mediterranean, Constantinople was fighting its own battles. These weren't battles with swords and sieges. They were fought with whispers, letters, carefully placed bribes, and strategic marriages. The palace was its own kind of warfare, and the casualties were just as real, even if they died from poison or political ruin rather than spears. At the center of this world were two people, Justinian and Theodora. The emperor and empress functioned as a dual power structure, and understanding Byzantine politics meant understanding how they worked together and against each other when necessary. Justinian was a micromanager. He involved himself in everything from military strategy to theological disputes to the price of bread. He slept maybe 4 hours a night, working through stacks of reports, drafting laws, interrogating advisors. People called him the emperor who never sleeps. And it wasn't affection, it was exhaustion. Everyone around him was constantly being summoned to meetings, asked for updates, required to justify decisions. The bureaucracy functioned efficiently because it was terrified of disappointing him. Theodora operated differently. She didn't micromanage, she positioned. She understood that power in Constantinople wasn't about making every decision. It was about making sure the right people were in the right positions. She cultivated networks of loyal officials, placed allies in key administrative roles, and maintained extensive intelligence networks that reported directly to her. While Justinian was buried in paperwork, Theodora was reading between the lines, understanding what people wanted, feared, and might do. Their marriage was unconventional by Byzantine standards. Theodora had been an actress and, according to hostile sources, a prostitute before marrying Justinian. The aristocracy never let her forget this. They whispered about her background, spread rumors, treated her with barely concealed contempt. She responded by outmaneuvering them politically, proving that competence mattered more than pedigree. The palace itself was a labyrinth of competing interests. You had the Senate, filled with aristocrats who resented Justinian's peasant origins and Theodora's scandalous past. You had the church split between different theological factions, arguing about the nature of Christ. You had the bureaucracy, staffed by career administrators who'd outlasted multiple emperors and intended to outlast this one too. And you had the military, divided between officers loyal to various generals. Navigating this required constant vigilance. An ally today might be an enemy tomorrow if circumstances changed. A policy that seemed reasonable could become a political disaster if the wrong faction opposed it. Everyone was watching everyone else, looking for weakness, opportunity, leverage. The issue of Belisarius fit into this landscape as both an asset and a problem. On one hand, his victories were legitimizing Justinian's reign. The reconquest of Africa and Italy proved that the emperor's grand vision of restoration was achievable. Every triumph Belisarius delivered strengthened Justinian's position against domestic critics who said the campaigns were too expensive and too risky. On the other hand, Belisarius's success made him dangerous. Byzantine history was full of successful generals who became emperors. The pattern was predictable. Win battles, gain army loyalty, march on the capital, claim the throne. Justinian knew this pattern intimately. He'd studied history obsessively. Every victory that made Belisarius more popular also made him more threatening. Theodora had a different perspective. She saw Belisarius as genuinely loyal, possibly because Antonina, his wife, was her closest friend. The two women had known each other since before either was powerful, back when Theodora was an actress and Antonina was the daughter of a charioteer. That bond mattered. Theodora trusted Antonina, and Antonina vouched for her husband's loyalty. But even Theodora hedged. She maintained her own intelligence network, monitoring Belisarius's movements, conversations, and decisions. Not because she thought he'd rebel, but because in Constantinople, you survived by knowing everything. The empress cultivated relationships with officers in Belisarius's army, men who'd report back if anything suspicious emerged. It was protection, insurance, the kind of careful paranoia that kept you alive in Byzantine politics. The church added another layer of complication. Justinian was obsessed with theological unity. He believed the empire needed religious conformity to function properly. The problem was that Christianity in the 6th century was deeply fragmented. The Orthodox faction in Constantinople held different views than the Monophysites in Egypt and Syria. The Pope in Rome had his own positions, and everyone was convinced their interpretation was the only correct one. Justinian tried to enforce uniformity through imperial decrees, which satisfied no one and angered everyone. Theodora, ironically, was more sympathetic to the Monophysites, partly from genuine conviction and partly from political calculation. Egypt and Syria were economically crucial provinces, and keeping them loyal required religious accommodation. So the emperor and empress sometimes worked at cross purposes, each supporting different theological factions. This created opportunities for ambitious clergy and administrators. If you could position yourself as essential to either Justinian's religious vision or Theodora's political network, you could gain significant power. Bishops became power brokers, monasteries became intelligence networks, theological debates became proxy battles for political control. The financial situation added pressure. Justinian's campaigns were expensive. Reconquering Africa and Italy required paying armies, building fleets, maintaining supply lines. The treasury was being drained, and someone had to pay for it. That someone was the tax-paying population, and they weren't happy. The tax collection system in Byzantium was brutal and corrupt. Collectors were expected to gather specific amounts from their districts. If they couldn't extract enough from the population, they had to pay the difference themselves. This incentivized maximum extraction. Collectors would squeeze every possible coin from peasants and merchants, using threats, violence, and confiscation. The result was a population that hated the tax system, and by extension, the emperor who demanded the revenue. Justinian was aware of the resentment, but felt trapped. He needed money to fund the reconquest. He needed the reconquest to legitimize his reign. He couldn't stop the campaigns without admitting failure, and he couldn't fund them without crushing taxation. The only solution was to win quickly, reconquer wealthy territories that would pay for themselves, and create a virtuous cycle of expansion and revenue. Except it wasn't working. Italy was conquered but devastated. Africa was producing revenue, but not enough to offset the costs. The Persian frontier required constant military presence, which meant more expenses. The empire was overextended, and everyone knew it except Justinian, who refused to admit that his grand vision might be unsustainable. The aristocracy watched all this with barely concealed satisfaction. Many of them had opposed Justinian from the beginning. He was too lowborn, too ambitious, too willing to challenge traditional power structures. They couldn't openly rebel, but they could obstruct, delay, and undermine. Bureaucratic resistance was an art form in Constantinople. A law could be passed but never enforced. Resources could be allocated but somehow never arrive. Reports could be written that technically obeyed orders while actually sabotaging them. Theodora spent enormous energy countering this resistance. She identified obstructionists and either neutralized them through bribery, blackmail, or occasionally murder. Byzantine politics didn't offer the luxury of gentle persuasion. If someone was blocking imperial policy and couldn't be bought or intimidated, they might suffer an unfortunate accident. The empress maintained networks that could arrange such accidents, though she was careful to keep her involvement deniable. The eunuch bureaucracy formed another power center. Eunuchs couldn't inherit property or found dynasties, which made them theoretically safe from dynastic ambitions. In practice, they were just as ambitious as anyone else, but their ambitions were channeled differently into administrative power, wealth accumulation, and patronage networks. Some of the most powerful figures in Constantinople were eunuchs who'd spent decades building influence. Narses, for example, was a eunuch who'd helped Belisarius during the Nika riots and would later become a general himself. He was loyal to Justinian and Theodora, but that loyalty was transactional. He supported the imperial couple because they gave him opportunities for power and wealth. If those opportunities disappeared, his loyalty would be renegotiated. This was the world Belisarius had to navigate whenever he returned to Constantinople. He was brilliant on the battlefield but nearly helpless in the palace. He didn't understand the subtle signals, the hidden meanings, the unspoken rules. He treated political questions like tactical problems, identify the objective, determine the most efficient path, execute. But palace politics didn't work that way. Efficiency was suspicious. Directness was naive. Honesty was dangerous. Antonina tried to protect him, using her friendship with Theodora to shield her husband from the worst political attacks. When rumors spread that Belisarius was too popular with his troops, Antonina would reassure Theodora of his loyalty. When Justinian questioned whether the general should be given another command, Theodora would advocate for him. It was a precarious arrangement, dependent on personal relationships that could shift at any moment. The tension came to a head repeatedly. Justinian would send Belisarius on campaigns, then recall him suddenly when he seemed too successful. The general would be investigated for disloyalty, cleared, then sent on another mission. It was a cycle of trust and suspicion, and it wore on everyone involved. Meanwhile, the empire continued functioning. Laws were written and enforced. Buildings were constructed. Justinian's architectural projects, including the Hagia Sophia, transformed Constantinople's skyline. Trade flowed through the capital, connecting Europe and Asia. The bureaucracy ground on, processing reports, collecting taxes, maintaining the vast administrative machinery that kept Byzantium operational. But beneath the surface, the strains were visible. The reconquest was costing more than anticipated. The tax burden was creating resentment. The military was overextended. The church was fragmented. And at the center, Justinian and Theodora were aging. They'd been ruling for decades now, and eventually someone would have to succeed them. That succession would be contested, possibly violent, and everyone was positioning for it. Belisarius, returning from Italy in 540, walked into this atmosphere of barely controlled chaos. He was the hero of the reconquest, the general who'd made the impossible possible. He was also a political liability, a man with too much prestige and too little understanding of how to use it safely. The question wasn't whether he'd survive the palace politics. The question was how long he could avoid being destroyed by them. Ravenna was the kind of city that made attackers despair. Built on marshland where the Po River Delta met the Adriatic Sea, it was surrounded by water, mud, and swamps that made conventional siege warfare nearly impossible. Roads became bogs in the rain. Supply lines could be cut by simply flooding the approaches. The city had been chosen as the Western Roman Empire's capital precisely because it was so difficult to attack, and the Ostrogoths had inherited that advantage. By late 539, Ravenna was the last major Gothic stronghold. Belisarius had spent 3 years methodically conquering Italy, taking city after city, and now only the capital remained. Vitiges, the Gothic king, was trapped inside with what remained of his army, maybe 10,000 men, down from the massive force that had besieged Rome. The war should have been over, except Ravenna wouldn't fall. Belisarius had surrounded the city, but surrounding wasn't the same as conquering. The Goths had ships in the harbor bringing supplies from across the Adriatic. They had enough food stockpiled to last months, maybe years. They had defensible walls, and a population that knew surrender might mean death or enslavement. The Byzantine army could sit outside Ravenna indefinitely, but actually taking it seemed impossible. Belisarius tried the standard approaches first. He positioned troops to block the land routes, hoping to starve the city. The Goths just brought in more supplies by sea. He attempted to negotiate, offering generous terms if Vitiges would surrender. The Gothic king refused. He'd already lost most of his kingdom, and surrendering the capital meant acknowledging total defeat. Better to hold out and hope circumstances changed. So Belisarius got creative. If he couldn't block the harbor completely, he could make it dangerous. Byzantine ships started patrolling the approaches, intercepting Gothic supply vessels. Not every ship. The harbor was too large to seal completely, but enough to make resupply difficult and expensive. Gothic merchants started demanding higher prices because the risk had increased. Food prices inside Ravenna began to rise. At the same time, Belisarius started building a chain barrier across the harbor entrance. It was an engineering project that took months. Massive chains had to be forged, anchored to the harbor bottom, positioned to block ships while allowing water to flow. The Goths watched this construction with growing alarm. If the chain worked, the harbor would be closed and Ravenna would be truly besieged. The Gothic response was predictable. They attacked the construction crews, sending ships and swimmers to cut the chains, sabotage the anchors, kill the workers. Byzantine forces had to guard the construction site constantly. It became a war within a war, fought in shallow water and mudflats with casualties on both sides and progress measured in feet rather than miles. By spring of 540, the chain was nearly complete. Gothic supply ships could still enter the harbor, but it was becoming harder. Food prices inside Ravenna were now triple what they'd been 6 months earlier. The population was starting to feel the pressure. Not starving yet, but worried, looking at their leaders and wondering how long this could continue. That's when the politics became more important than the military situation. The Gothic nobility inside Ravenna weren't united. Some supported Vitiges and wanted to fight to the end. Others thought continuing the war was pointless. The Byzantine Empire was too large, too wealthy, too persistent. Better to negotiate the best terms possible while they still had leverage. A faction of Gothic nobles approached Belisarius with a proposal. They would overthrow Vitiges and open the city gates if Belisarius would accept the crown of Italy, make himself king, rule independently from Constantinople, let the Goths maintain their lands and status under a new regime. It was the same offer they'd made before, now with more urgency because Ravenna's situation was deteriorating. Belisarius's response was complicated. He knew that refusing the offer meant the siege would continue indefinitely. He also knew that accepting would mean rebellion against Justinian, which went against everything he believed about loyalty and duty. But there was a third option. Appear to accept the offer, get inside the city, then reveal that he'd never intended to rebel. It was deception. It violated his usual straightforward approach to warfare. But after 3 years of fighting in Italy, watching the countryside devastated and cities destroyed, Belisarius wanted to end the war without another massive siege that would kill thousands. So he played along. He met with the Gothic conspirators and suggested, without explicitly promising anything, that he might be open to their proposal. The Goths heard what they wanted to hear. Belisarius was careful with his words, never actually agreeing to become king, but not refusing either. It was the kind of diplomatic ambiguity that he usually despised, but the alternative was more bloodshed. The Gothic nobles, convinced they'd secured his cooperation, began preparing their coup. They spread word among key garrison commanders that Belisarius would be entering the city as their new king, that Vitiges would be deposed, and that everyone's positions would be secure under the new regime. Most of the Gothic nobility, exhausted by years of war and seeing no path to victory, accepted this as the least bad option. In May of 540, the gates of Ravenna opened. Belisarius entered with his guard, supposedly to be crowned as the Gothic king. The city received him with a mixture of relief and suspicion. Some Gothic nobles genuinely believed he'd accept the crown. Others suspected a trick but couldn't do anything about it. The gates were open, Byzantine troops were inside, and armed resistance would just mean dying in the streets. Vitiges, betrayed by his own nobles, was arrested without resistance. He didn't fight. He didn't even protest much. He'd been king for 4 years and watched his kingdom collapse around him despite his best efforts. By the time Belisarius reached the royal palace, Vitiges seemed almost relieved that the burden was being lifted. Then Belisarius made his position clear. He wasn't accepting the crown. Ravenna was part of the Byzantine Empire. Vitiges was a prisoner who'd be sent to Constantinople, and the Gothic nobles who'd conspired would be treated as surrendering under terms of mercy rather than as partners in a new regime. The Goths realized they'd been outmaneuvered, but by then it was too late. The Byzantine army controlled the city, and resistance would be suicide. The reaction among the Gothic nobility was bitter. They'd been promised independence under Belisarius's rule and gotten submission to Constantinople instead. Some felt betrayed, others recognized they'd been outplayed. Belisarius had used their own ambitions against them. Either way, the Gothic kingdom was finished. Vitiges was transported to Constantinople, where Justinian treated him generously. The former king received estates in Anatolia and a comfortable pension. He lived quietly for several years before dying of natural causes. It was a remarkably civilized end for someone who'd fought a 4-year war against the empire. Justinian could afford to be generous in victory. The fall of Ravenna should have ended the Gothic War. The kingdom was conquered. The king was captured. The major cities were under Byzantine control. Italy was Roman again. Belisarius had accomplished the mission. Everything Justinian had wanted, restoration of the Western Empire, reconquest of Italy, elimination of the barbarian kingdoms, had been achieved. Except the news from Constantinople wasn't celebrations and triumph. It was suspicion and accusations. Justinian had received reports about Belisarius's negotiations with the Gothic nobles. The emperor knew about the offer to make Belisarius king. And even though the general had refused and delivered the city to Byzantine control, Justinian couldn't stop wondering, had Belisarius been genuinely loyal, or had he only refused because circumstances hadn't been right? The ambiguity was poisonous. Belisarius had used deception to take Ravenna without a siege, smart tactics, but it also meant he'd engaged in secret negotiations with enemies offering him a crown. From Justinian's paranoid perspective, that was dangerously close to treason, even if the ultimate outcome was loyalty. So the emperor's response to the conquest of Ravenna was mixed. Public praise and celebration. Belisarius was officially the hero who'd restored Italy. Private suspicion and closer surveillance. The general was officially under investigation for potentially treasonous communications with Gothic conspirators. The contradiction was quintessentially Byzantine. Belisarius was recalled to Constantinople in late 540. The official reason was that he was needed for the Persian frontier, where tensions were escalating. The actual reason was that Justinian wanted him out of Italy before he became too entrenched, too powerful, too difficult to remove. A general who'd conquered an entire kingdom and been offered its crown was too dangerous to leave in place, even if, especially if, he'd refused the offer. The Italian campaign had lasted 5 years. It had cost thousands of lives and enormous treasure. It had devastated the Italian countryside, destroyed cities and displaced populations. But it had achieved its objective. Italy was Byzantine again. The Gothic kingdom was destroyed. The dream of Roman restoration was real. What no one fully appreciated yet was how temporary this victory would be. The Goths would rebel again within years. The Byzantine hold on Italy would prove fragile. The territories Belisarius conquered would need to be reconquered repeatedly. and the general himself, having delivered everything Justinian asked for, would discover that success in Byzantium could be more dangerous than failure. But in the summer of 540, returning to Constantinople with Vitiges as his prisoner, Belisarius was still the empire's greatest hero. The crowds still cheered. His soldiers still followed him with absolute loyalty. Justinian still needed him, even while fearing him. How long that precarious balance would last was anyone's guess. But the pattern was established. Belisarius would serve brilliantly, Justinian would suspect constantly, and the empire would benefit while slowly destroying its greatest defender. The reconquest continued, but the cost was becoming clear, and eventually someone would have to pay it. The problem with conquering territories is that you then have to hold them. Belisarius had learned this in Africa, and he was about to learn it again in Italy. Victory on the battlefield was one thing. Building a sustainable occupation was something else entirely. By 541, barely a year after Ravenna fell, the Gothic resistance was rebuilding. The kingdom might be destroyed, but the Goths themselves were still in Italy, thousands of warriors who'd melted into the countryside rather than surrendering. They had no central authority, no king, no coordinated strategy, but they had desperation, local knowledge, and a population that was increasingly resentful of Byzantine occupation. The Byzantine administration that moved into Italy after the conquest was everything the Goths had feared. Tax collectors descended on cities and rural areas, demanding payments that locals couldn't afford. The imperial bureaucracy imposed regulations that made no sense in the Italian context. Officials from Constantinople, who'd never seen Italy before, made decisions based on outdated maps and wishful thinking. The occupation was incompetent, extractive, and deeply unpopular. This created opportunities for Gothic resistance. A nobleman named Totila emerged as a rallying point. He was young, capable, and had survived the war by avoiding the major battles. While Vitiges had been captured and the old Gothic aristocracy destroyed, Totila represented a new generation. He started gathering scattered Gothic forces, promising liberation from Byzantine corruption and a return to the relatively stable rule the Goths had maintained before the war. By 542, Totila had an army, not as large as the forces Vitiges commanded, but large enough to threaten Byzantine garrisons. He started recapturing cities in central Italy, and the pattern was telling. Local populations often welcomed him. The Goths under Totila promised lower taxes and less bureaucratic interference. For ordinary Italians, that was more appealing than Byzantine rule. Justinian received reports of the Gothic resurgence with a mixture of anger and denial. He'd spent years and enormous resources conquering Italy. The campaign was supposed to be finished. How were the Goths rebuilding? Where were they getting support? And why weren't the Byzantine forces in Italy stopping them? The answer was that the Byzantine forces in Italy were inadequate. After Belisarius's recall, Justinian had drastically reduced the garrison. The emperor needed troops for the Persian frontier, where another war was brewing. He also wanted to cut costs. Maintaining a large army in Italy was expensive, and the treasury was depleted. So the Italian garrison was reduced to a skeleton force, barely enough to hold the major cities, insufficient to patrol the countryside. The commanders left in Italy weren't Belisarius. They were competent enough, but they didn't have his tactical genius or his ability to win with minimal resources. When Totila attacked, they responded conventionally, defending fixed positions, waiting for reinforcements, following the standard military playbook. Totila, meanwhile, fought asymmetrically. He avoided set-piece battles, raided supply lines, besieged isolated garrisons, and gradually reclaimed territory. By 544, most of central and southern Italy was back under Gothic control. Totila was being called the new Gothic king, though he hadn't formally claimed the title. Rome itself was threatened. The Great Reconquest, which had seemed so complete just 4 years earlier, was unraveling. Justinian's response was to send Belisarius back to Italy, not with a fresh army, not with adequate resources, but with whatever forces could be scraped together from other commands. The emperor still needed his best general, but he couldn't, or wouldn't, give him the tools to do the job properly. Belisarius was being asked to reconquer Italy a second time, except now with fewer soldiers, less money, and an enemy that had learned from the First War. Belisarius arrived in Italy in 544 and immediately understood how bad the situation was. The Byzantine garrisons were demoralized, undersupplied and barely holding key cities. The Gothic forces controlled most of the countryside. The local population was hostile or at best neutral, and there were no reinforcements coming. Constantinople had given him a mission without the means to accomplish it. He did what he'd always done, improvised. With a small mobile force, he started harrying Gothic positions, avoiding major battles, but conducting raids that disrupted their operations. He couldn't defeat Totila's army in open combat. The numbers weren't there, but he could make holding territory expensive and dangerous. It was guerrilla warfare, except the guerrillas were the official imperial army. For 2 years, Belisarius fought this increasingly desperate campaign. He won small victories that didn't change the strategic situation. He held Rome for a while, then lost it when Totila besieged the city and the garrison couldn't hold without relief. He recaptured Rome, then lost it again. The war had become a grinding stalemate where neither side could deliver a decisive blow. The worst part was that Belisarius knew exactly what was needed to win: more troops, consistent supply lines, proper funding, and time to rebuild a professional occupation force. But Justinian couldn't provide any of those things. The empire was overextended, the treasury was empty, the Persian frontier demanded attention. The plague, a catastrophic epidemic that would later be called the Plague of Justinian, was ravaging the empire, killing millions and destroying the tax base. Everything was falling apart simultaneously. The great reconquest that Justinian had dreamed of was consuming resources the empire didn't have. Italy was being devastated by continuous warfare. Africa was reasonably stable, but not generating the revenue needed to pay for the wars. The Balkans were being raided by Slavic and Hunnic tribes that Byzantium no longer had forces to repel, and the whole imperial project was crumbling under its own weight. In 548, Justinian recalled Belisarius again. Not because the Italian situation was resolved, it clearly wasn't, but because the emperor needed him elsewhere. The Persians were threatening major offensives. The Balkans needed defending. And honestly, keeping Belisarius in Italy for years with inadequate resources was starting to look like deliberately setting him up to fail. Belisarius left Italy knowing the job was unfinished. Totila still controlled most of the peninsula. The Gothic resistance was stronger than when he'd arrived 4 years earlier. The entire second phase of the Italian campaign had been a costly exercise in futility, and everyone knew it. The pattern was now undeniable. Justinian would send Belisarius on impossible missions with inadequate resources. The general would perform miracles but fall short of complete success, because complete success was impossible under the constraints. Then Justinian would recall him, vaguely disappointed, and send him somewhere else to repeat the process. It was exhausting. Belisarius was in his 50s now, old for a field commander in an era when most men didn't live past 60. He'd spent decades fighting wars for an emperor who needed him but couldn't fully trust him, who demanded victories but wouldn't provide the resources to achieve them. who celebrated his successes while investigating him for treason. The empire was exhausted too. The reconquest had cost more than anyone anticipated. Italy was devastated. North Africa was barely paying for its own administration. The plague had killed maybe a third of the empire's population, destroying the economic base that funded everything. The dream of restoring the Roman Empire was bankrupting the actual Byzantine Empire. But Justinian couldn't admit this. Admitting failure would mean acknowledging that his grand vision was unsustainable. So the campaigns continued, underfunded and undermanned, achieving partial victories that required constant refighting. It was madness disguised as strategy, and everyone except the emperor seemed to understand this. Theodora, watching all this unfold, tried to moderate Justinian's ambitions. She argued for consolidation rather than expansion, for securing what had been conquered rather than attempting new conquests. But she died in 548, and with her death, Justinian lost the one person who could occasionally talk him out of his more grandiose plans. Without Theodora's moderating influence, Justinian became even more rigid. He was convinced that the reconquest could still work if everyone just tried harder. More taxation would fund more campaigns. More campaigns would secure more territory. More territory would generate more revenue. The logic was circular and unsustainable, but it was also the foundation of his entire reign. Questioning it would mean questioning everything. Belisarius, returning to Constantinople in 548, was a very different person from the young officer who'd won at Dara 18 years earlier. He was older, worn down, and increasingly aware that the empire he served was consuming itself. But he didn't know how to do anything except serve. It was his identity, his purpose, the thing that gave his life meaning. So when Justinian sent for him again, asking him to command forces against yet another threat, Belisarius prepared to go. Not with enthusiasm, those days were gone, but with the grim determination of someone who'd committed his entire life to a cause and couldn't stop now. The wars would continue, the empire would keep fighting, and Belisarius would keep serving, even as both he and the empire he served were slowly being destroyed by the effort. The question was which would break first. By 559, Belisarius was 70 years old. Maybe older. The records were unclear, and he'd never been important enough as a child for anyone to note his exact birth year. 7 decades in an era when 50 was considered a long life. He'd spent nearly 40 years in military service, fighting wars from Persia to Africa to Italy and back. His body was failing. His eyesight was weakening. He moved with the careful deliberation of someone whose joints hurt constantly. He should have been retired. Most generals his age were dead, or living on estates somewhere, telling old war stories to anyone who'd listen. But Belisarius was still in Constantinople, still technically available for service, still the man Justinian called when situations became desperate. And in 559, the situation was desperate. Again. The Kutrigur Huns had crossed the Danube with a massive raiding force, maybe 7,000 cavalry, though numbers in ancient sources were always questionable. They'd bypassed Byzantine frontier defenses through speed and mobility, and now they were in Thrace, the same region where Belisarius had grown up. They were raiding settlements, burning farms, and moving toward Constantinople itself. The imperial capital had walls that had never been breached. 40 feet high, triple-layered, maintained for centuries. But walls required defenders, and Constantinople's garrison had been stripped over the years to send troops elsewhere. The city had maybe 2,000 soldiers available, most of them garrison troops with no field experience. Against 7,000 Hun cavalry, that was suicide. Justinian was 80 years old and panicking. The emperor who'd reconquered Africa and Italy, who'd built the Hagia Sophia and reformed the legal code, was faced with Hun raiders threatening his capital. He called for his generals, and most of them gave pessimistic assessments. The city could withstand a siege, but the Huns weren't besieging, they were raiding. They'd devastate the suburbs, take thousands of slaves, and disappear before any relief force could organize. Someone mentioned Belisarius. The old general was in the city. He had experience fighting steppe nomads. Maybe he could do something. Justinian, desperate enough to set aside decades of suspicion, sent for him. What followed was one of those moments that would have seemed fictional if it weren't documented by multiple sources. The aged emperor and the aged general, both at the end of their lives, meeting in the palace while Hun raiders approached the capital they'd spent their lives building and defending. Belisarius listened to the situation, asked a few questions, and gave his assessment. The Huns were cavalry, fast, mobile, excellent at hit-and-run attacks, but vulnerable if they could be forced into a stand-up fight. The problem was getting them to commit to a battle rather than just raiding and withdrawing. He had a plan. It was crazy. It probably wouldn't work, but it was better than watching helplessly while the suburbs burned. Belisarius requested 300 veterans from the Imperial Guard, not the garrison troops, but the actual professionals who'd seen combat. He also asked for permission to recruit from the city's civilian population, anyone who could ride a horse and carry a weapon. Justinian, having no better options, agreed. Within 2 days, Belisarius had assembled an improvised force of about 2,000 men. 300 were real cavalry soldiers who knew what they were doing. The rest were civilians, merchants' sons, craftsmen, people who'd learned to ride but had never fought in an actual battle. It was barely an army. Against Hun raiders, it should have been a massacre. But Belisarius understood something that most commanders didn't. Perception mattered as much as reality. If the Huns thought they were facing a professional Byzantine army, they'd fight differently than if they knew they were fighting hastily assembled civilians. The key was making his force look more dangerous than it was. He drilled the civilian recruits relentlessly. Not complex tactics, there wasn't time, but simple formations. How to maintain a line, how to advance together, how to look disciplined and professional from a distance. It was theater, but effective theater. At 100 yards, a formation of well-drilled civilians looked the same as a formation of veterans. The Hun raiders were approaching from the north, moving through Thrace toward the suburbs of Constantinople. Belisarius positioned his force at Melantius, a fortified position about 20 miles from the capital. It was defensible ground with good sight lines, the kind of terrain that would force cavalry to approach carefully. When the Hun scouts spotted the Byzantine force, they reported back to their commanders that there was an army blocking the approach to Constantinople. Not a huge army, but organized and positioned defensively. The Hun leaders, cautious, decided to probe the position before committing to a full assault. The first Hun attacks were tentative. Small groups of cavalry would approach, shoot arrows and withdraw, testing the Byzantine response. Belisarius had positioned his 300 professionals at the front, where they'd be most visible. They responded with disciplined archery and coordinated movements, exactly as a veteran force would. The civilians positioned behind just had to maintain formation and look threatening. The Huns pulled back and reassessed. This wasn't the weak garrison they'd expected. This looked like a proper Byzantine army, organized and commanded by someone who knew what they were doing. The question was whether to attack or bypass the position and raid elsewhere. Then Belisarius did something unexpected. He ordered a limited advance. Not a full charge that would expose his civilian recruits, but a controlled forward movement that suggested confidence. The message was clear. We're not hiding behind fortifications. We're ready to fight. This was a calculated gamble. If the Huns called his bluff and attacked in force, His improvised army would disintegrate, but if they believed the bluff, they might decide Constantinople wasn't worth the risk and withdraw. The Hun commanders conferred. They were raiders, not conquerors. Their goal was to take plunder and slaves, not to fight costly battles. A professional Byzantine army, even a small one, could inflict serious casualties. And for what? The suburbs of Constantinople had some wealth, but nothing compared to the risk of losing half their force in a fight. They withdrew, not in panic. Steppe cavalry didn't panic, but systematically, pulling back from the Byzantine position and heading north toward easier targets. Within days, they'd crossed back over the Danube, laden with plunder from less defended regions, but having avoided a direct confrontation with Belisarius's force. Constantinople was saved, not through a dramatic battle or heroic last stand, but through bluff, positioning, and the reputation of a 70-year-old general who'd spent 4 decades making enemies overestimate Byzantine capabilities. Justinian was relieved, and briefly, grateful. Belisarius had saved the capital with an improvised force and tactical brilliance. For a moment, it was like the old days, the emperor needing the general delivering, the partnership working. But the moment didn't last. Within months, the old suspicions returned. Belisarius had assembled a force of 2,000 men, loyal to him personally. He'd commanded them in battle near the capital. In Byzantine political terms, that was dangerous. What if he'd decided to march on the palace instead of defending against the Huns? The fact that he hadn't was reassuring, but it also reminded Justinian that Belisarius could have. The investigation began quietly. Imperial commissioners examined the recruitment records. How had Belisarius assembled the force so quickly? Who had funded it? Were there political connections being established? The questions were bureaucratic, routine, but they carried an edge of suspicion that Belisarius knew well by now. He was tired of fighting, tired of suspicion, tired of serving an emperor who needed him but couldn't trust him. He'd saved Constantinople, and his reward was another investigation into his loyalty. The pattern had repeated for 30 years, and it wasn't going to change now. But Belisarius didn't complain. Complaining would just confirm suspicions that he resented the emperor. Instead, he answered the commissioners' questions, provided the records they requested, and waited for the investigation to conclude. It did eventually, with the usual result. No evidence of disloyalty found, but the questions remained. The defense against the Kutrigo Huns would be Belisarius's last military service. He was too old, too worn down, for any more campaigns. Justinian didn't send for him again, possibly because there were no more crises that required his specific talents, possibly because the emperor was becoming uncomfortable with how irreplaceable the old general had become. Belisarius spent his remaining years in Constantinople, not in disgrace. Officially, he was still honored, but not in power either. He was a relic, a reminder of earlier victories, someone people respected but didn't involve in current affairs. The empire had moved on. New generals, younger men, were commanding the armies. New administrators were running the bureaucracy. The age of Justinian and Belisarius was ending. The emperor was aging too. Theodora was long dead. The grand projects were mostly completed or abandoned. The reconquest had stalled. Italy was partially controlled. Africa was stable. But the dream of fully restoring the Roman Empire was recognized as unachievable. Justinian spent his final years on religious matters, trying to enforce theological unity that never quite materialized. And Belisarius, the man who'd saved the empire repeatedly, who'd conquered kingdoms with inadequate forces, who'd remained loyal despite every provocation, lived quietly in the capital he'd defended one last time. His reputation was secure in military circles, Every tactical manual would reference his campaigns for centuries, but politically, he'd become irrelevant. The question that would haunt his final years was whether any of it had been worth it. The campaigns, the victories, the decades of loyal service to an emperor who never fully trusted him. Had it preserved the empire? Temporarily? Had it restored Rome? Partially. Had it justified the cost in lives, treasure, and personal sacrifice? Belisarius, not given to philosophical reflection, probably didn't dwell on these questions. He'd been a soldier. He'd done what soldiers do: follow orders, win battles, serve the state. The rest, meaning legacy, historical judgment, wasn't his concern, but history would judge anyway, and the verdict would be complicated. The final chapter of Belisarius's life began with an accusation. In 562, 3 years after he'd saved Constantinople from the Hun raiders, someone came forward claiming that the old general was involved in a conspiracy to assassinate the emperor. The accuser was unreliable, the evidence was thin, and the whole thing had the feel of a political setup. But in Byzantium, accusations didn't need to be credible to be dangerous. Belisarius was arrested. Not dramatically, no soldiers bursting into his house at midnight, but with the bureaucratic efficiency that characterized Byzantine persecution. Imperial commissioners appeared with documents. The general was politely informed that he was being investigated for treason. His property was confiscated pending the outcome. He was placed under house arrest while the investigation proceeded. Justinian was 81 years old now, increasingly paranoid, seeing conspiracies everywhere. The emperor who'd once trusted Belisarius enough to give him armies now saw threats in every corner, and the old general, who'd spent 40 years proving his loyalty, was about to be tried for plotting the emperor's murder. The trial, if it could be called that, was a formality. There was no real evidence. The testimony came from people with dubious motives and contradictory stories. But the point wasn't to establish guilt. The point was to demonstrate that even the empire's greatest hero wasn't above suspicion, that no one was safe from imperial scrutiny, that loyalty was never sufficient to protect you. Belisarius defended himself with the same directness he'd used in military campaigns. He pointed out the logical absurdities in the accusations. Why would he plot assassination now after decades of having opportunities to rebel? What would he gain? He was 73 years old, in declining health, with no political ambitions. The conspiracy made no sense. The court listened, deliberated, and eventually cleared him. Not enthusiastically. There was no declaration of innocence or apology for the accusations. The verdict was simply that sufficient evidence for conviction was lacking. It was the bureaucratic equivalent of saying, "We're not sure you're innocent, but we can't prove you're guilty, so we're letting you go." His property was eventually returned, though the process took months, and some valuable items mysteriously disappeared during the confiscation. His reputation was damaged. People who'd respected him now wondered if there might have been something to the accusations after all. And most importantly, the message was delivered. Belisarius could be arrested, tried, humiliated, regardless of his past service. Justinian, having made his point, moved on to other matters. The empire continued its slow decline. The reconquered territories were slipping away again. The treasury was empty. The plague had devastated the population. But the emperor maintained the fiction that everything was fine, that the grand vision was still achievable, that one more campaign or one more reform would fix everything. Belisarius withdrew from public life. He was released from house arrest, but made no effort to return to court or seek vindication. He spent his remaining years in his Constantinople mansion, an old man whose service had been repaid with suspicion and whose loyalty had been rewarded with accusations. He died in March of 565. The date is certain, March 13th. The circumstances are less clear. Some sources say he died peacefully in his bed. Others suggest illness. The cause doesn't matter much. He was 76 or 77 years old, which was ancient for that era. He'd outlived most of his contemporaries. He'd survived wars, sieges, political intrigues, and investigations. But time eventually wins. Justinian outlived him by 8 months, dying in November of 565. The emperor who'd dreamed of restoring the Roman Empire, who'd built the Hagia Sophia and reconquered Africa and Italy, who'd reformed the legal code and persecuted heretics and bankrupted the treasury in pursuit of impossible ambitions. He died believing he'd succeeded, even as the evidence of failure surrounded him. And then, the legends began. Within a generation of Belisarius's death, stories started circulating about his final years. The most persistent was that Justinian had ordered him blinded, his eyes put out, as punishment for the alleged conspiracy. That the greatest general in Byzantine history had spent his last years as a blind beggar on the streets of Constantinople, asking passers-by for alms. "Give an obol to Belisarius," the legend said he would cry, reduced from conquering kingdoms to begging for coins. The story was powerful, tragic, a perfect metaphor for the ingratitude of empires toward their defenders. Artists would paint scenes of blind Belisarius begging. Writers would compose poems about his fall. The image became iconic. The loyal general destroyed by the paranoid emperor. Virtue punished, loyalty rewarded with cruelty. There was only one problem. It almost certainly wasn't true. The historical evidence shows that Belisarius died wealthy, in his own home, surrounded by family. He was never blinded. He never begged. The trial happened, the accusations were real, but the dramatic punishment was fiction. The legend emerged later, probably because people wanted the story to have a more poetic ending. The actual ending, old general dies in bed after being investigated, but ultimately left alone, wasn't dramatic enough. But the myth persisted because it captured something true about Byzantine politics, even if the specific details were false. Belisarius's service had been extraordinary. He'd saved the empire multiple times. He'd conquered territories, won impossible battles, remained loyal when rebellion would have been easy, and his reward had been suspicion, investigation, and accusations. Not blindness and begging, but not gratitude either. The myth was emotionally accurate even if factually wrong. That's why it endured. People understood that empires consume their defenders. That loyalty is dangerous in systems built on paranoia. That serving brilliantly can make you threatening rather than valued. Belisarius's actual fate, investigated, cleared, allowed to live quietly until natural death, proved the same point as the legendary fate, just less dramatically. The irony is that the legend probably did more for Belisarius's historical reputation than the reality would have. The blind beggar story made him a tragic hero, a symbol of virtue destroyed by tyranny. Artists and writers used him to critique authoritarian systems, to argue for rewarding loyalty, to warn about the dangers of paranoid leadership. The mythical Belisarius became more influential than the real one, and perhaps that would have amused the actual Belisarius if he could have known. He'd spent his life dealing with reality, logistics, tactics, political necessities. He'd never been concerned with symbolism or legacy, but history converted him into a symbol anyway, and the symbol was powerful precisely because it simplified and dramatized the complexity of his actual life. The real Belisarius was a brilliant tactician who served a paranoid emperor. He won battles through preparation and intelligence rather than heroic charges. He remained loyal not from naivety, but from a genuine belief that the empire was larger than any individual. He was investigated and tried, but ultimately died peacefully of old age. It was a complicated story without clear heroes or villains. The legendary Belisarius was simpler, the virtuous general destroyed by the ungrateful tyrant. It was morally clear, emotionally satisfying, and useful for making political points. It was also largely fictional. History remembers both versions. The scholars study the real Belisarius, his campaigns, his tactics, his political navigation. The public remembers the legend, the blind beggar asking for alms. Both versions contain truth. The actual facts and the emotional reality of what it meant to serve Justinian's Byzantium. What would Belisarius himself have thought of this dual legacy? Impossible to know. He left no memoirs, no philosophical writings, no personal reflections. Everything we know about him comes from external observers, historians like Procopius, who admired his military skill while speculating about his political motives, official records that documented his campaigns, and later legends that simplified him into a symbol. The man himself remains elusive. Was he genuinely loyal or just calculating that loyalty was safer than rebellion? Was he indifferent to glory or resentful of how he was treated? Did he die satisfied with his service or bitter about the accusations? The sources don't tell us. Belisarius kept his own counsel, did his job, and left interpretation to others, which is fitting in a way. He was a professional who focused on the work rather than the recognition. The empire used him, suspected him, investigated him, and ultimately let him die peacefully. Not the tragic ending of legend, but perhaps the ending he would have chosen. Service rendered, duty fulfilled, life lived on his own terms within impossible constraints. And the empire he served? It would survive another 900 years after his death, slowly declining, gradually losing the territories he'd reconquered. Italy would fall away. Africa would be conquered by Islamic forces. The dream of Roman restoration would fade into nostalgia. Byzantium would become something different, still calling itself Roman, still powerful at times, but never again achieving the imperial scope that Justinian had envisioned and Belisarius had fought to realize. Was it worth it? The campaigns, the victories, the decades of service. From the empire's perspective, yes, Belisarius bought Byzantium time, secured territories temporarily, and demonstrated that Roman military excellence could still win. From Belisarius's perspective, probably also yes. He'd done what he believed was right, served the state, maintained his integrity even when it cost him. From history's perspective, the answer is more ambiguous. Great achievements at terrible cost. Brilliant tactics serving an unsustainable strategy. Individual excellence unable to overcome systemic dysfunction. The story of Belisarius is the story of Byzantium itself, capable of remarkable things, ultimately unable to escape its own contradictions. The blind beggar legend got one thing right. Even if the facts were wrong, there is something tragic about Belisarius's life. Not because he was literally blinded and reduced to begging, but because his excellence couldn't fix the empire's fundamental problems. He won every battle and lost the larger war. He remained loyal and was rewarded with suspicion. He served brilliantly and died knowing the work was unfinished. That's the real tragedy. Not a dramatic fall, but the slow realization that even genius and loyalty can't overcome systemic failure. The empire needed Belisarius. It also destroyed him slowly, through suspicion and impossible demands, and it died anyway centuries later, having consumed its best defenders in service of an unsustainable dream. The legend simplified this into a morality tale. Reality was messier, but both versions, legend and history, point to the same conclusion. Empires are dangerous to serve, even when you serve them brilliantly, especially when you serve them brilliantly. To understand what Belisarius left behind, You need to understand what Roman meant by the 6th century. The word had become complicated. The actual city of Rome was in ruins, controlled by whoever happened to be winning the latest Italian war. The Western Roman Empire had collapsed a century earlier. The Eastern Roman Empire, Byzantium, still existed but was Greek-speaking, Orthodox Christian, and culturally distinct from the classical Rome of Caesar and Augustus. Yet everyone still called it Roman. The emperors were Roman emperors. The army was the Roman army. The law was Roman law. The identity persisted, even as the reality transformed. And Belisarius was perhaps the last person who embodied what that identity originally meant. The idea that Rome could conquer anywhere, defeat anyone, impose order on chaos through discipline and tactical brilliance. His military legacy was immediate and profound. Every tactical manual written in the following centuries referenced his campaigns. The defense of Rome during the Gothic siege became a textbook example of how to hold a position with minimal forces. The Battle of Dara was analyzed by military theorists for its use of terrain and combined arms tactics. The African campaign demonstrated the effectiveness of rapid amphibious operations. But more than specific tactics, Belisarius established principles that defined Byzantine military thinking for generations. The idea that smaller professional forces could defeat larger armies through superior discipline and coordination. The concept of strategic mobility, moving armies quickly to exploit opportunities rather than committing to grinding attritional warfare. The importance of logistics and supply lines as weapons in themselves. These weren't new ideas, but Belisarius demonstrated their effectiveness so convincingly that they became doctrine. His command style also influenced how Byzantine generals operated, the emphasis on understanding terrain before committing to battle, the practice of explaining tactical plans to officers so they could adapt if circumstances changed, the maintenance of strict discipline, not through terror, but through consistent standards, the integration of diverse military cultures, Romans, Huns, Goths, Herulians, into coordinated fighting forces. These approaches became part of Byzantine military culture, taught to new officers and referenced in strategic planning. The irony is that Belisarius's greatest innovations were organizational and psychological rather than purely tactical. His battles weren't won through revolutionary new weapons or formations. They were won through better preparation, better intelligence, better coordination, and better morale. He made conventional tactics work through excellence in execution, which sounds simple, but was actually revolutionary in an era when most armies were poorly led, irregularly supplied, and barely disciplined. Later Byzantine generals tried to emulate him with mixed results. Some, like Narses, succeeded. The eunuch general who eventually conquered Italy permanently had learned from watching Belisarius operate. Others failed because they copied the tactics without understanding the principles. Belisarius's victories looked easy in retrospect, which led people to underestimate the skill involved. It's a common problem with genius. It makes difficult things look simple, which encourages others to try without adequate preparation. His political legacy was more complicated. Belisarius demonstrated that a general could remain loyal even when offered crowns and independence. This was both reassuring and unsettling for future emperors. Reassuring because it proved that not every successful general would rebel. Unsettling because it set an impossible standard. Future emperors expected Belisarius-level loyalty while providing minimal resources and maximal suspicion. The pattern he established became toxic. Emperors would send generals on difficult campaigns with inadequate support, expecting tactical brilliance to compensate. When generals failed to achieve Belisarius-level success, they were blamed for incompetence. When they succeeded too well, they were suspected of disloyalty. The system had learned the wrong lesson. It remembered Belisarius's victories without understanding the conditions, adequate resources, strategic flexibility, political support that made those victories possible. This dynamic contributed to Byzantine military decline over the following centuries. Talented generals were recalled prematurely, investigated constantly, and given impossible missions. The expectation was that they'd somehow pull off Belisarius-style miracles through pure competence. When they couldn't, because miracles aren't reproducible, the system blamed the generals rather than the systemic dysfunction. It was a perfect recipe for wasting military talent. Belisarius also became a symbol in broader political discourse. Writers used him to critique imperial paranoia. When Byzantine intellectuals wanted to argue that emperors should trust their servants, they'd reference Belisarius's loyalty. When they wanted to illustrate the dangers of excessive suspicion, they'd point to how Justinian treated his greatest general. He became shorthand for the virtuous servant destroyed by the ungrateful master, even though the actual historical Belisarius survived reasonably well. The blind beggar legend, false though it was, served this symbolic purpose perfectly. It dramatized the ingratitude of power toward excellence. Artists throughout the medieval and early modern periods painted scenes of blind Belisarius begging, using the image to critique their own rulers and systems. The historical inaccuracy didn't matter. The emotional truth was compelling enough. In military terms, Belisarius's campaigns had mixed long-term results. North Africa remained Byzantine for about a century before falling to Islamic conquest. Italy was partially held but required constant reconquest and was eventually lost. The Persian frontier remained contested. None of his victories created permanent stability, but they did buy time. A century or two of continued Byzantine control in the Mediterranean, which allowed the empire to survive long enough to eventually stabilize in a different form. This raises an uncomfortable question. If the territories were eventually lost anyway, did Belisarius's conquests accomplish anything lasting? The traditional view is yes. He preserved Roman civilization, maintained cultural continuity, and demonstrated that the empire could still project power. The revisionist view is no. He wasted resources on unsustainable campaigns that accelerated Byzantine decline. The truth probably lies somewhere in between. What's undeniable is that Belisarius expanded what seemed militarily possible. Before his campaigns, the idea of reconquering the Western Empire seemed fantastical. After his campaigns, it seemed merely very difficult. That shift in perception mattered. It meant that Byzantine military thinking remained offensive and ambitious rather than purely defensive. Whether that was ultimately good for the empire is debatable, but it certainly shaped Byzantine strategic culture for centuries. His personal qualities also became part of the Byzantine ideal of the virtuous general. Loyalty, competence, discipline, personal courage, and political restraint. Military handbooks would reference Belisarius as the exemplar of these qualities. The fact that demonstrating these qualities hadn't protected him from suspicion and investigation was conveniently overlooked. The ideal and the reality existed in separate spheres. Perhaps the most significant legacy was simply that Belisarius existed at all. In an era of decline, dysfunction, and collapse, he proved that individual excellence still mattered, that tactical brilliance could overcome numerical superiority, that professionalism could triumph over corruption, that discipline and preparation could defeat chaos. In a period when most of the news was bad, territories lost, populations dying from plague, treasury empty, Belisarius's victories were proof that the empire could still accomplish remarkable things when led by remarkable people. This matters because empires in decline desperately need such proof, not for external enemies, but for internal morale. Citizens need to believe their civilization is still capable of greatness. Soldiers need to believe their sacrifices serve a meaningful purpose. Administrators need to believe the system can still function. Belisarius provided that belief through tangible achievements. He kept the idea of Roman excellence alive when reality was suggesting it was dead. The cost, of course, was borne by Belisarius himself. His entire adult life spent in service to an emperor who needed him but couldn't trust him. His tactical genius used to achieve strategic objectives that proved unsustainable. His loyalty rewarded with suspicion. His victories followed by inadequate support for maintaining them. He gave everything to preserve an empire that consumed his service while doubting his motives. Was it worth it? From a purely rational perspective, probably not. From the perspective of meaning and purpose, perhaps yes. Belisarius seems to have genuinely believed that serving the Roman state, however dysfunctional that state had become, was worthwhile in itself, not because the state deserved it, but because civilization needed defending and someone had to do the work. That attitude, service as duty rather than transaction, is what made him exceptional. Most people then and now serve conditionally. They'll be loyal if rewarded, competent if recognized, disciplined if appreciated. Belisarius served unconditionally, and Byzantine bureaucracy had no idea what to do with that. It suspected his motives because unconditional service seemed impossible. People don't act that way without ulterior motives, except sometimes they do, and Byzantine political culture couldn't process it. Later generations would romanticize this, creating the legend of the perfect general destroyed by imperial ingratitude. The reality was more nuanced. Belisarius survived, was investigated but cleared, died peacefully. But the legend captured the emotional reality that unconditional service in a conditional system is inherently tragic. The system will use you completely while trusting you minimally. Your excellence makes you valuable and threatening simultaneously. There's no way to win, only different ways to lose. And yet, people kept serving. Byzantine generals after Belisarius continued fighting for emperors who suspected them, continued achieving victories with inadequate resources, continued demonstrating loyalty that was never quite sufficient to eliminate suspicion. Why? Partly because there were no better options, partly because of genuine patriotism, partly because serving something larger than yourself, even when that something is flawed, provides meaning that purely personal pursuits don't. Belisarius embodied this complicated relationship between individual and empire. He was neither a simple hero nor a naive dupe. He was a professional who understood exactly what he was doing, accepted the costs, and did the work anyway, because civilization needed defending and he was capable of defending it. That's not romantically tragic, it's pragmatically realistic, and maybe that's the real legacy. The last great Roman general wasn't destroyed by the empire. He served it with full knowledge of what service cost, achieved what was achievable, and died having done everything he could. Not a legend, just a man who was very good at his job and kept doing it despite impossible circumstances. The empire he served would fall eventually. The territories he conquered would be lost. The tactical brilliance would be studied, but never quite replicated. But the example, competence, discipline, loyalty, even when costly, endured as an ideal that later ages would reference even if they couldn't match. Rome needed many things to survive: resources, political stability, economic strength, administrative efficiency. It had some of these, lacked others, and ultimately failed to sustain the combination necessary for permanence. But for a brief period in the 6th century, it had something else. A general who could win battles he shouldn't win, hold territories he couldn't defend, and serve loyally when loyalty was dangerous. That wasn't enough to save the empire. Nothing would have been enough. But it bought time, preserved memory, and created a legend of what Roman military excellence had once been. Belisarius was the last person to embody that excellence completely. After him, there would be competent generals, occasionally brilliant ones, but no one who combined tactical genius with absolute loyalty in quite the same way. The model broke with him, partly because the conditions that produced him never recurred, partly because the empire learned the wrong lessons from his career. But the memory persisted. The last great Roman general, the man who reconquered kingdoms with inadequate forces, the loyal servant who refused crowns, the tactical genius who died in bed rather than in battle. History remembers, and in remembering keeps the ideal alive even when the reality is long gone. The story should have ended with Belisarius's death in 565. One old general dying peacefully in Constantinople, buried with honors appropriate to his rank, mourned by those who'd served with him, forgotten within a generation by everyone else. That's how most military careers end, even the successful ones. But Belisarius's story refused to end. It transformed, mutated, became something larger than the historical facts. Within decades of his death, the legends began. Not just the blind beggar story, but others. Tales of miraculous victories where he'd supposedly defeated armies 10 times his size through divine intervention. Stories of his absolute loyalty, despite being offered crowns by half the Mediterranean. Accounts of his tactical genius that made every battle sound like a chess match, where only he could see the board clearly. Some of these stories were based on real events, exaggerated. Others were complete fabrications that attached themselves to his name because his reputation made them credible. Byzantine military culture absorbed these stories eagerly. Every military academy, every training manual, every strategic discussion referenced Belisarius. Not always accurately, the details got garbled over time, but consistently, he became the standard against which all other generals were measured. What would Belisarius have done? Became a question commanders asked themselves when facing difficult tactical situations. The answer wasn't always helpful because circumstances differed, but the question itself revealed how thoroughly he'd penetrated military thinking. The church also claimed him. Despite Belisarius having no particular reputation for piety during his lifetime, later hagiographers portrayed him as a model Christian warrior. Paintings showed him praying before battles. Stories emerged of him founding churches and monasteries. The theological disputes that had consumed so much of Justinian's energy were retroactively projected onto Belisarius, who was depicted as fighting for Orthodox Christianity against Arian heretics. None of this was particularly historical, but it served the Church's purposes in establishing models of Christian military virtue. Arab military theorists, after the Islamic conquest of Byzantine territories, also studied Belisarius's campaigns. They recognized his tactical innovations even while conquering the territories he'd once reconquered. Islamic military manuals from the 8th and 9th centuries referenced the siege of Rome and the African campaign as examples of effective defensive strategy and rapid offensive operations. The irony, Islamic commanders learning from the general who'd fought to preserve Christian Roman control, wasn't lost on anyone, but practical military knowledge transcended religious boundaries. Medieval European writers discovered Belisarius during the Crusades, when Western Europeans became reacquainted with Byzantine history. He appeared in chronicles and epics, usually heavily fictionalized. The real Belisarius, pragmatic, professional, politically cautious, was transformed into a romantic hero who fought for honor and loyalty above all else. This version bore little resemblance to the historical figure, but it served medieval purposes. reinforcing the ideals of chivalry and feudal loyalty that the aristocracy wanted to promote. The Renaissance brought renewed interest in classical sources, including the writings of Procopius, who'd accompanied Belisarius on his campaigns. Humanist scholars studied his tactics more systematically, trying to extract lessons applicable to 16th century warfare. Machiavelli referenced Belisarius in discussions of military leadership and the relationship between generals and princes. The lessons drawn were often contradictory. Machiavelli used Belisarius to argue that princes should fear competent generals, while others used the same example to argue that loyal generals should be trusted, but the discussions revealed how malleable the legacy had become. The Enlightenment era produced the most famous version of the blind beggar legend. Jean-François Marmontel's novel Bélisaire, published in 1767, depicted the loyal general reduced to poverty and blindness by imperial ingratitude. The novel was wildly popular, translated into multiple languages, and firmly established the tragic narrative in European cultural consciousness. The fact that it was historically inaccurate didn't matter. It captured something emotionally true about the relationship between power and service, and that emotional truth resonated across cultures and centuries. Artists seized on this image. Paintings proliferated, showing blind Belisarius begging in the streets, often with the caption, "Date bolum Belisario," give a coin to Belisarius. These paintings appeared in palaces and public buildings across Europe, serving as moral instruction. This is what happens when rulers are ungrateful, when loyalty is repaid with cruelty, when excellence is punished rather than rewarded. The political message was clear, even if the historical facts weren't. Military academies continued to study the real campaigns. Napoleon supposedly admired Belisarius's use of mobility and his ability to win with inferior numbers. Prussian military theorists analyzed the defense of Rome as an example of effective position warfare. American Civil War generals referenced his campaigns when discussing how to operate in hostile territory with limited supply lines. The tactical lessons remained relevant even as warfare technology advanced far beyond anything Belisarius would have recognized. The 20th century brought more critical historical analysis. Scholars began distinguishing between the legendary Belisarius and the historical figure. They noted that his victories, while impressive, were often temporary. Territories he conquered were lost within decades. They pointed out that the campaigns he fought contributed to Byzantine overextension and eventual decline. Some revisionist historians argued that Belisarius had been complicit in an imperial project that was fundamentally unsustainable and should never have been attempted. These criticisms had merit. The reconquest of Italy did devastate the peninsula and produce only temporary Byzantine control. The resources spent on these campaigns were enormous and contributed to treasury depletion. Justinian's grand vision, which Belisarius implemented militarily, was arguably a strategic mistake that weakened Byzantium. A more defensive policy focused on consolidating existing territories might have served the empire better in the long term. But this analysis, however accurate, missed something important. Belisarius didn't design the strategy, he executed it. The decision to reconquer was Justinian's. The general's responsibility was to accomplish assigned missions with available resources. By that metric, he succeeded brilliantly. Criticizing him for implementing flawed strategy is like criticizing a surgeon for operating on a patient who shouldn't have been operated on in the first place. The fundamental decision wasn't his to make. What remains undeniable across all interpretations, romantic, critical, military, political, is that Belisarius represented something that resonates across time. The competent professional operating within a dysfunctional system, the skilled practitioner serving flawed leadership. The individual of excellence trapped in structures that don't reward excellence consistently. These dynamics aren't unique to 6th century Byzantium. They're universal features of hierarchical organizations, which explains why Belisarius's story keeps getting retold in different contexts. Modern military professionals still study his campaigns, now with computer simulations and detailed battlefield analysis. The Battle of Dara appears in War College curricula as an example of defensive positioning and combined arms coordination. The defense of Rome is taught as a masterclass in urban warfare with limited forces. The African campaign demonstrates the effectiveness of strategic surprise and rapid exploitation of success. The tactical lessons remain valid 15 centuries later, which says something about how fundamental his innovations were. But perhaps the deeper legacy is psychological rather than tactical. Belisarius demonstrated that excellence matters even when systems are corrupt, that professionalism can triumph over dysfunction, that individual competence can compensate for organizational failure, at least temporarily. This is simultaneously inspiring and depressing. Inspiring because it suggests that individuals can make a difference. Depressing because it implies that systems will keep demanding individual excellence rather than fixing systemic problems. The empire Belisarius served collapsed eventually. Not immediately. Byzantium survived another 900 years after his death, but inevitably. The territories he reconquered were lost. The tactical innovations were studied and then rendered obsolete by gunpowder. The political structures that produced him vanished. Everything he fought for in material terms disappeared. What didn't disappear was the idea that competence and loyalty and discipline matter, that professionalism is worth pursuing even in imperfect circumstances, that serving something larger than yourself, even when that something is flawed, provides meaning that pure self-interest doesn't. These aren't comfortable ideas. They can be used to exploit people, to demand sacrifice without offering adequate reward, but they're also essential for any functional society. Someone has to do the difficult work. Someone has to maintain standards when systems are crumbling. Someone has to serve even when service isn't appreciated. Belisarius was that someone. Not perfectly. He made mistakes, had limitations, operated within the moral framework of his era, but sufficiently well that his example endured through 15 centuries of vastly different historical contexts. The specifics changed. The legendary blind beggar, the romantic hero, the tactical genius, the cautionary tale about imperial ingratitude, but the core remained constant. One person, doing the best possible work under terrible circumstances, achieving more than should have been possible through excellence and determination. Is this legacy worth celebrating? It depends on what you think societies need. If you believe systems should be reformed until individual excellence becomes unnecessary, then Belisarius's story is a depressing illustration of how broken systems consume talented people. If you believe that systems will always be imperfect and someone needs to maintain functionality despite that imperfection, then his story is instructive about how to serve effectively under adverse conditions. History doesn't resolve this tension. It just records what happened. One general fought brilliant campaigns for an overextended empire, achieved temporary victories that bought time without solving fundamental problems, remained loyal when rebellion would have been easier, and died having accomplished everything possible within impossible constraints. Then the story was retold, embellished, mythologized, and used for various purposes by people with different agendas. The empire fell. The general died. The tactics were studied. The legend persisted. And 1500 years later, we're still discussing whether the loyalty was admirable or tragic, whether the victories mattered given their impermanence, whether serving a flawed system honorably is virtue or delusion. Perhaps the answer is that it's both. Virtue and tragedy aren't opposites, they often coexist. Belisarius served brilliantly, which was virtuous. The service didn't save the empire, which was tragic. Both things are true simultaneously. History contains more ambiguity than morality tales allow, but it also contains examples of what human excellence looks like under pressure, how competence operates when surrounded by incompetence, how discipline functions when structures are chaotic, how loyalty manifests when rulers are paranoid. Belisarius provided such an example, preserved not just in historical records, but in the continuing resonance of his story across cultures and centuries. The last great Roman general, the man who reconquered an empire, the loyal servant who refused crowns, the tactical genius who won impossible battles, the political innocent who navigated Byzantine intrigue, the old soldier who defended Constantinople one last time, the investigated veteran who died peacefully despite accusations, the legendary beggar who never actually begged. All these versions of Belisarius exist simultaneously in historical memory. Some are more accurate than others. All contain fragments of truth. Together they form a legacy that transcends the specific facts of one man's life in the 6th century. They speak to universal tensions between excellence and mediocrity, loyalty and self-interest, individual capability and systemic dysfunction. Empires rise and fall. The Roman Empire that Belisarius served is long gone. But the questions his life raises, how to serve flawed systems honorably, how to maintain standards when structures crumble, how to achieve excellence despite impossible odds, remain as relevant now as they were then. The echoes continue, in military academies studying his tactics, in political discussions about loyalty and leadership, in artistic representations of the blind beggar, in historical debates about whether the reconquest was strategic brilliance or strategic mistake, in the continuing fascination with a general who did everything asked of him and received suspicion instead of gratitude. Belisarius reconquered an empire temporarily, but permanently he conquered something else, the historical imagination. The story refuses to die because it contains truth that transcends specific circumstances, not simple truth. The legacy is too complex for simple lessons, but truth about what human excellence looks like, what it costs, what it achieves, and what it cannot save. That truth echoes eternally, long after the empire and the general have both turned to dust.